And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, all kinds of wildness going on this week. So much so that to get a good HotZone episode out, there have been so many distractions.
Yes, such as?
You've got Biden sticking.
And his Corvette.
You know, it's always good to have those classified details hanging out in your trunk. Although I will say the whole thing is strange, and I don't buy into any of the cover story for it, and I don't believe in the back and forth. This is kind of like some kind of a central thing behind it all, trying to keep a balance of power going on between Biden and Trump. And they've been heavily in favor of Biden, of course, but now they've done a strange thing. And since we all know that they're out to get Trump, then that doesn't make a whole lot of sense operating like this. And also for it to be the exact same thing that was behind the raid that happened at Mar-a-Lago back there in the
weird,
summer.
Right?
Yeah, it's one of these things that there's handwriting on the wall for somebody. We just haven't quite figured out who it is yet. But it is interesting that my term, Stepford Biden, is getting around. Now I see all these other people using it. This is interesting to me. And of course, the X series has that effect on people. It's great to have everyone here tonight. Tonight we have something special for you, which is a deep exploration of the hot zone. And you know, we've done the Hot Zone episode since we started the show, the X series show, a little over 4 years ago. And for me, those episodes, you know, the research behind them form the foundation, really, of the X series, because so much of what goes on in relation to exotic technology, deep politics, the UFO file, ancient ruins, archaeological wars, and all these kind of power plays in the background happens right there. And this is a very interesting area. And for those of you who are kind of familiar with the Hot Zone episodes, but not completely, I'm just going to give an outline that the Hot Zone comprises this area that is right off the coast of Florida, goes to Bimini, which is one of the islands right off the coast of Florida, and stretches out to the western tip of Cuba. And then if you kind of draw, not like the Bermuda Triangle, but if you draw kind of a wide angle area from there to the Yucatan Peninsula, you're going to find all of these things taking place in the Bahamas and the Gulf Stream relate to these secret ruins that are there, and which, again, like stealth archives, rise to the surface of our educational fields, whether it's National Geographic, even the New York Times reported when Zelensky found the Cuban city.
We're having sound issues again.
Oh, is it really? Interesting. Well, we've got everything rolling, so I'm inclined to think that we'll probably just keep on trucking. But I'm always a good sport. What else have you got over there, Miss Olivia?
I don't know. I'm a little frightened.
No, that's fine. What's your vibe and all that?
Everybody's in a good mood. They're looking forward to this episode.
Fantastic.
And I guess the sound started out okay, but now, yeah, that is the underwater effect as we had last Friday.
No, we didn't have it last Friday, right? That's the whole point. Okay, well, it does not look, there's nothing in the settings that would give us one of those. Hang on a second. Yeah, hold that.
Sorry, guys. Do you want to switch to my mic?
No, actually, I want to just keep rolling, actually, and we're just going to keep on going with it. Yeah, it looks like it's the kind of thing that might just
work itself out.
Be a stream issue. That would be my guess. And everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 143, and we're going deep tonight into the Hot Zone. And the Hot Zone really comes up as sort of a central core of the things we're reporting on here. This one is UFOs in the Hot Zone. And UFOs in the Hot Zone gives us this kind of window angle into the whole thing, because what you're dealing with when you get into the hot zone, you're dealing with issues relating to exotic technology. You're dealing with the issues relating to the deep politics and the intrigues that go on there. So there's a reason for all that. And if you look at some major issues, like the Cuban Missile Crisis brought us to the brink of nuclear war. And, we have all these things with Cape Canaveral and all our major launches into space and all the rest of it. Everything kind of transpires there in a major way. And if you go deeper than that, you're going to see that a good deal of the Apollo missions relied very heavily on our knowledge and our awareness of that area of the Atlantic. And there's a good reason for that. There's sort of a magnetic center that doesn't get discussed in regular physics, in regular science. And the only hint that we have of it, in fact, are obscure references in scientific papers. And then, the really kind of far out stories of the Bermuda Triangle. And that all plays into this, but it also plays into something very, very ancient, which is that area also tended to have this kind of magical aspect to it in ancient times as well. And there's lots of stories relating to that. Anytime you get around this, Christopher Columbus discovering America, well, he discovers the Bahamas. So it's always right in the middle of history, and there's a good reason for that. We're going to get into it tonight because at one point it was the absolute center. I also want to remind everyone before we get started, especially if you're new, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. And this is a free newsletter that keeps us in touch with each other, and also is the kind of thing where, with the social media censorship, it works in a number of different ways. In other words, they can just throw you off the networks, or they can do what they call de-amplifying you. And when they de-amplify you, people don't get your notifications and all the rest of it. Now, that goes round and round, and they want you to really spend your time being ticked off about that and talking about that instead of the important core issues that we're addressing. So all I want to say in relation to that kind of stuff is we see a lot of it. We get a lot of different types of censorship through all the different platforms. And I've had people on the tech side, remember originally, I have a lot of those tech connections. I've had them do analysis of the kind of tech censorship that we experience, and it is heavy. So the easiest, quickest way around it, sign up for that newsletter at darkjournalist.com and stand up and be counted for all the exciting shows that we have coming up for you, including all the X series episodes for January and February, which are going to be mind blowers and extensive, deep interviews, powerful interviews coming up. And if you're lucky, some documentaries are on the way as well. How are we doing out there?
Doing absolutely great.
Good. Any questions rolling around?
No, nothing yet. I hadn't heard this term, but Shubru said he's calling the Corvette issue Car-a-Lago, which is great.
Good. Excellent. Yeah, that's what it is. Well, we've seen a number of things in relation to Biden that, again, they had this stuff before the election, so they held out and they didn't announce it by then. So they were already playing this stuff for maximum effect. In my mind, again, though, I never like it when things are a little too pat and easy. So it's bothersome to me. If anything, somebody's playing pretty heavy cards back and forth, and they're leveling out the playing field. I've done a analysis of Trump's recent fortunes, and a lot of things that aren't being reported on, things like the fact that the Georgia grand jury tampering, vote tampering thing, that case they've finished with. They just fined him $1.6 million for the tax case in New York. That's nothing. That doesn't go anywhere. The J6 committee is wrapped up. They didn't get to subpoena Trump. They have no charges against Trump. I mean, Trump really, for all the legal trouble that they were pushing in October and after Mar-a-Lago, basically the only thing they have left is the Mar-a-Lago case. And now that's been neutralized with the fact every lawyer is coming out and saying, this whole case is neutralized because Biden has the same problem. What are you going to do? And the Wall Street Journal came out with an article along the same lines. It's basically a push. So all of those different legal dangers that Trump faced, they've all basically evaporated in the past 2 months, which tells me that there is going to be a very, very major Trump effort to gain the presidency next year. And I think that they're looking at that and thinking that they need, on the Democratic side, to remove the standard bearer of Stepford Biden and to move on to a different candidate that will just, try to make Trump look archaic. That's where I think the play is, but we'll see it as it goes on. There was a major UFO report that came out of the government and the Arrow office, which is part of the office that they got together with the National Defense Authorization Act. They've been locking and lobbing these things in. And it's so funny because before we get to the UFO report, Janet Yellen was doing all this complaining about, how they need to raise that debt ceiling and, oh my goodness, we won't be able to pay our bills and all this stuff. And, there's this big push. It's like, oh, showdown and all the rest of it. Look, they just authorized $1.7 trillion 2 weeks ago. I think you'll be able to float on 1.7 trillion for a couple of months, while they figure this out. So that whole emergency thing, oh, we constantly need money, lift that debt ceiling so we can print more money to lower the value of your dollar. I mean, at what point do you just call the game for the BS that it is? So we need to look at that. And if there are people who are saying, that we shouldn't be spending money and maxing out the credit card in the United States, those are the people we should be listening to. And I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican or whoever. Unfortunately, over and over again recently, we're seeing that the Democrats are getting behind, they're behind mandates. They're behind all this inflation spending, they're behind the war in Ukraine. I mean, come on. Democrats really need to get it together, and establishment Republicans as well. It looks like there's the independents in the middle and a band of sort of libertarian minded Republicans. They're the only ones who are running under the original principles of the country. So back to heavy duty, major constitutional oversight of the budget. It has to happen, or else, you're going to be giving $1 trillion a year to this military who's fighting no wars. And where's all that money going? And now they want more. So these are the things that need to come into focus in 2023, and you have to get there. So this UFO report is interesting because, it's sort of like, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to pitch this as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And they're just throwing it in and building it up. So it's an adjunct to an already bloated defense budget because they don't have anywhere else where they can say, well, we need another $500 billion, $2 trillion. And remember, this is just the money that's on the books. As we know, in the Pentagon, most of the money is going off the books. That's where most of the spending is going. And it's going out the back door into a gigantic space infrastructure on one side and a major underground complex power play on the other. So we on the surface don't get to see any of this. And we get, we're kind of living in the middle of it. And we're supposed to put up with everything, and, whenever they pull a medical crisis, they're like, hey, we can drag you out of your home and fill you with all the toxic sludge that we desire, or you're going to lose your job, so we're going to have to make some decisions in America about what we want. And that could definitely be the type of light for the rest of the world. And, it has to be basically kind of freedom fighters all over the world who just have had enough of all of this. And I think that's where we're headed. That's why I keep going back to this slogan for 2023, which is no surrender. And I think that's just the way that we have to play it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep now tonight, we're going to go into the hot zone. I'm going to take you down there into the Bahamas, into Cuba, into Bimini, off the coast of Florida, the Yucatan Peninsula. We're going there for a reason. We're going to find some very interesting characters, some very interesting ruins, some very interesting predictions down there as well. We're going to be taking questions in the second half of the program. and Miss Olivia will be putting those together. You can ask them now.
In all caps, please.
Okay. And how are you doing out
I'm
there?
doing great. Karen Carpenter wanted to know if you had any comment on Chris Wray and Avril Haines leading the U.S. delegation to Davos.
Well, I think it's a violation of what their job is. I mean, Davos is a financial economic forum where, the heads of all these companies get together. So Christopher Wray, being the FBI director, who, by the way, is a gift from Trump, right? That wasn't such a good move. But, what is Wray doing hanging out with Bill Gates and all these people, except to say, hey, we're going to have this thing between law enforcement and surveillance and the technology that you're building. So, there's already been, in the things that we're seeing about social media over the past 5 years, and this whole wave with Twitter files, which basically, I have to say, this information's been out there for a long time. And I don't find that particularly satisfying investigation. I think it's getting very watered down in general. But the idea, the thrust of it is actually correct, which is that the social media companies are doing massive surveillance against their users. And we've been saying this for years, that they've been slanting the conversation, switching up elections, silencing dissidents, Twitter dissidents and all the rest of it. So this is the nature of the things. Like so many of the things that are happening in the world is kind of catching up to the scenarios that we've been playing out here in the Ideas From With You. And I think this is important because, a lot of these things are coming out, but I've also reinforced this idea that in 2023, what we need more than ever is the idea of potency. That is, coming forward with something really deep to say about the UFO file. For example, when they do hearings in government over UFOs and everyone's like, oh, they're being so transparent, they're having a hearing. Well, if they don't reveal anything, there's no transparency there. Or if they are just building up some idea of a threat, that's just for their own benefit. So CIA disclosure has nothing to do with actual UFO disclosure. Real disclosure would be putting people who've hidden this and spent the country's money behind closed doors and putting them under oath and getting answers from them about who's behind all this secrecy. That's real, that's potent. And the types of reporting that gets you there. So that's what dark journalism is. I don't want to see fluff things about the JFK assassination or the CIA. I want to see real hardcore movements, like the letter that we sent to Speaker McCarthy. They can open this up. They can put people under oath. They can connect their UFO investigation piece with the JFK assassination investigation piece. They're going to find that those are combined. They're twain under the surface. And when we find something along the lines of people just kind of hovering around headlines for a thrill, like I say with a lot of the major media companies like Fox and all the rest of it, that's low potency stuff. They're using high potency things that they got probably from this program and other programs on this level of independent media, and they're just throwing them up there because they say people are interested in this. But what we're going to do is we'll just do this fluff thing. So we'll do a UFO show, but we'll invite all these CIA people on. That's not the same thing. So we need to not only get to the issues, but deep examination of the issues. That's where the potency piece comes in. And that's what we're going to do here. But I think that it becomes crucial because I've been seeing a lot of fluff in the mainstream and in independent circles around this. And to me, it just looks like astroturfing, where they're just jumping on a trend, a media trend, and they consider us, the trend to jump on. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Okay, now X Series 143, deep into the hot zone. I'll read a letter here. You might have mentioned, you might remember I mentioned last year in a Hot Zone episode about a pilot named Trig Adams. There's a classic episode we did last year called The Colonel in the Hot Zone. And it is, in fact, Colonel Sanders' grandson. He was an excellent pilot, and he was part of that original group, along with his mom, searching for ruins. And they were very connected with the Casey Foundation and the work of Edgar Casey. I never found out, even though I've read extensively about it, why that was so, except that they're both from Kentucky, and that might be part of it. but they formed something called Mars Inc., which is Marine Archaeology Research Society. And um, Colonel Sanders' daughter and Trigg, that's Margaret Adams and Trigg Adams, um, really did these deep investigations there, trying to figure out if Casey's prediction, that is the psychic Edgar Casey, predicting that Atlantis was rising there in the Bahamas, and it was this major piece of Atlantis, a temple that was part of the Poseidians, which is the last group, major group of Atlanteans who were very technologically advanced. This all came through the Casey trance source. Now, Casey's very interesting in this sense, which is many of the things that he pinpointed down there, they've been able to find. So whatever kind of deep researches that he was doing, the kind of remote viewing, but on a real true psychic level, he was getting geographical data as well as he was tapping into it. There's a Casey section in here tonight, which is so important. But Casey in 1926 pointed out that there were going to be ruins that would be rising in Bimini because this was part of a once great continent. And he was giving these Atlantis readings in the 1920s, and there ended up being some 900 readings dealing just with Atlantis of the almost 15,000 that he gave. Now, it's very interesting because these readings about Bimini attracted different types of people. One of the groups that came in there was a business group that was thinking about making Bimini into a tourist attraction. So they became curious hearing that the psychic was giving readings out there. And in 1928, there's another series of readings. Now, this group, I find the people who were taking these readings is kind of it's an ordinary business group, but then it turns out being a little bit shadowy as we get in a little bit deeper. And what happens is, for one of the first times when Casey is giving readings, the copies of the readings disappear. Now, they're able to keep copies of all the readings there at the association. They have for years and years. And even in the 1920s, they kept meticulous copies through Casey's stenographer, Gladys Davis. And they had a very good recording system. So they would have a copy of the reading and give a copy of the reading. But in the Bimini readings, the original readings for this business group, we have those and we can look at those. But then the follow-up readings disappeared. And they notably disappeared. The group itself disappeared as well. And there's an interesting occurrence where in 1931, Casey goes to New York and he's there. There's a number of stock people who want him there to give, and there's like a psychic society that wanted to get him to give a lecture. And he shows up and he's giving this lecture and he's talking about these things, and there show up those business guys who came for the original Bimini readings. And they're in the audience, and he's like, oh, there they are. I haven't seen those guys in 3 years. I guess I'll talk to them when I'm done. Goes through the reading. When he gets done, he goes down there and they're finished. They're not there. They've disappeared. So they weren't there to talk to him. They were there to see, is he mentioning anything about this key factor that he gave us? So as a result of all this, in 1932, he gives a deep series of readings at the ARE, all in the Bimini situation. And we get all of this deeper info about what's there and what's rising there. And that's why land rising is a theme that you see we come back to over and over. So there's just a few interesting things. Of course, we've pointed out in the Hot Zone shows the amount of people that you're going to find there in Bimini under very interesting circumstances. Of course, Hemingway, who's a deep piece of this tonight, but we've done a number of episodes on Hemingway in the Hot Zone. And his presence there, along with his brother Les, who is founding New Atlantis. All right. Martin Luther King, Richard Nixon, the Kennedys, Bimini, just this incredible sort of visiting spot. And yet it wasn't very well established. It wasn't even very well worked out until the past, say, 20 or 30 years. So it wasn't the easiest place to go vacation in, as it were. One of the more interesting recent guests is Sir Richard Branson, who surprised his guests there in Bimini. And, his reason for doing all this, island hopping supposedly is that he's looking for these great blue sinkholes at the bottom of the ocean. And he just happens to be doing it with the most high-tech equipment right there in the hot zone. Well, he's also going into space. This guy is getting around. Now, in this letter by Trigg Adams, who's the grandson of Colonel Sanders, he writes to Hugh Lynn Casey in 1968. It's actually October of 69. This is after the Bimini Wall has been found. And remember, he was part of the original group that had spotted that out, but J. Manson Valentine, who is the Yale explorer, he ended up being the one who was credited with it, and he sort of disassociated himself from this Mars group. Here's the letter, and that's the actual letter, so everyone gets a shot. But let's take a look at this. Hugh Lynn Casey, Association for Research and Enlightenment, Virginia Beach, Virginia. Dear Hugh Lynn, it's come to my attention that Colonel Rockwell, head of North American Rockwell Corporation, is a member of the Association of Research and Enlightenment. A subsidiary of that company has recently been acquiring large areas of Bimini and islands south for development, much like those suggested in the readings. I'm led to believe that the readings provided the impetus for this action, although I doubt that at the corporate level this would be widely known, if at all. I was hoping that you might be able to give us any information on this if it is not supposed to be a secret and you know of any. Of course, if it would be possible to arrange an introduction through you, the ARE, it sure would be helpful. I feel sure that the Colonel would be interested in the work of Mars and the approach that it takes. The data has not come back yet from the last trip to Bimini a few weeks ago, where we used $35,000 worth of fancy electronic gear. That's in 1969. Loaned to us by the manufacturers for a survey. We have hopes that it will provide another link in the chain of data being forged in the scientific curiosity. We'll keep you informed. Okay. This letter is very interesting because his mom is obsessed with finding Atlantis. And she puts that in her own book, and it's well known about her, in fact. So she's got a deep connection to this Casey Bimini Atlantis Rising theme, which is happening there in the hot zone by Bimini. And also the quest for these Poseidon temples that Casey says are right there, right off the coast of Bimini, rising under the slime of ages. Now, Colonel Rockwell is a very interesting figure for him to be hearing these things about and for him to be associated with the Casey readings, because if you do a deep dive on Colonel Willard Rockwell, as we are going to tonight, you're going to find him associated with the most heavy-duty technological advances on planet Earth, including the Apollo moon program, the trips to Antarctica, and Star Wars development for President Reagan, along with the implications of deep secret UFO research. Now, so let's take that first foundational thread of Trigg Adams saying, I'm hearing all this stuff that Rockwell is buying up Bimini, which turns out to be true. And one of the places, I'm going to kind of start at the end in this way. One of the things that ends up happening, of course, Rockwell will go through all these different versions and his sons will take over and Lockheed will buy this part and, all the rest of it. There's still a deep aspect of it left called Astrotech, but I'm going to take us through some of the things that Rockwell did. And of course, Bimini's new $250 million Rockwell Island luxury home development breaks ground. That is something that came as a news story some 10 years ago. So Rockwell went from aerospace to real estate there in a very interesting move. A very leisurely maneuver.
We just to interrupt you for a second. Debbie Klingelsmith in the Ideas Room says, I worked for Rockwell in the 80s. I worked on the B-1 bomber and my hubby was a space shuttle engineer. An insider.
Wow, that's great. Well, here's the interesting thing when we get around Rockwell is you're dealing with basically, unquestionably, one of the biggest companies. So that was happening, period. Just a few of the things that they were involved in. That's Colonel Willard Rockwell. Okay. And if we get into his history a little bit, it's quite interesting because we're going to find that it was the Mellons that recruited him very early on, and the Mellon banking family. And of course, we know Chris Mellon is on the scene now pushing for the UFO thing after working with the Bushes and the Clintons and the DOD and this intelligence group and that intelligence group. Well, back here, Willard made himself, kind of the man of the century by being close with that Mellon power group. And it's very interesting, their relationship back in Pittsburgh. And these notes of the rebellious colonel speaks out are very interesting. One of the things I think that should be kind of kept in mind about him immediately is that he was a candidate for the Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower. And it turned out that they had said, well, you can't hold all that stock because it's a conflict of interest, and he bowed out. But we have to think of the kind of swing of this guy, the heft. A little background. Born in 1888, Willard F. Rockwell. Colonel Rockwell was born March 31st, 1888, Boston, Massachusetts. Ring a bell? Sounds familiar. Rockwell was educated at MIT, close by. Class of 1908 in Mechanic Arts School. Following his graduation, Rockwell was employed by the Axle Company in Cleveland and a factory manager, vice president, going on this very corporate trip. 1925, he's recruited by the Mellons, and he directs their Pittsburgh Equitable Meter and Manufacturing Company. This is very interesting. They did every kind of meter, from water meters to taxi meters, and they had this incredible reach and influence in that one division. So what happens is he kind of gets more and more connections going, and he becomes very involved with the polar flights and very interested in this whole Antarctica piece. Now, we mentioned in the last episode, there was this character, Lloyd Berkner, who went there actually during the late 20s with Admiral Byrd to Antarctica. And he's another one who seems at the heart. He was with the Robertson panel. He seems at the interface of this UFO, Antarctica, exotic technology piece and the secrecy inside the government. And again, what's interesting is trying to identify the X-protect versus X-share qualities in some of these people. And Berkner, my tendency is to say that he was kind of swinging between both, getting a lot of pressure from the X-protect group, but actually was more aligned with the X-share people. I'm going to open up some of the relevant pieces about Thomas Townsend Brown tonight, who I think is a core X-share figure, who's somebody who wants to take the exotic technology and move the culture forward with it. This is a dynamic quality that these types have. And at the very top, John Kennedy, President Kennedy, would be sort of the ultimate X-share person because he's trying to break that through. And I guess the ultimate X-protect piece is sort of that Men in Black, don't say too much crowd. So a little bit more about Rockwell. I think when we look, we see him very active in World War II. We see him getting recruited to be defense secretary, although he doesn't make it. And then one of the things he did in the 60s, I think, is interesting, which is he is on the Rockwell polar flight, November 14th to 17th, 1965, the first round-the-world flight over the North and South Poles. So, real mover and a shaker, and he sets up North American Rockwell Corporation as the corporation that can take us to the moon. And they're the ones who are going to build the Saturn V rockets and all the rest. And they end up doing just that. Now, as we get around him, remember that he's identified by Trig Adams, who's figured out this guy is a part of the ARE, and he reaches out to Casey's son and says, can you get us introduced to this guy? And why is he buying up most of Bimini and all the rest of it? Well, it's interesting. When you go into some of the imagery that was being used by Rockwell, here you see pyramids going into space. These are like promo shots for some of their projects, but they all have this esoteric overhang. That's one, Miss Olivia. later, after the colonel dies and his son takes over, they start envisioning these almost like AI astronauts piloting things. And in some of their promo, again, for that, you have these unusual kind of vacant, cyborg types who are running these ships. And, they got the green head and stuff. I mean, there's definitely unusual imagery, shall we say, going on the minute they connect up to the space piece. Pyramids, androids. What's going on here? That's another one.
Wow.
And you're going to find when we get around the Rockwells that there are all sorts of spin-off companies. So, I'm just going Rockwell International is the kind of umbrella group for all of them. And there are divisions that get sold off over time. But like I said, it's always like the Howard Hughes Corporation, Boeing, or Lockheed that's doing the buying up. It's like one big circular motion. Now, one of his sons, it got me curious when I was looking into him because it talked a lot about Kappa Sigma, and then Sigma Tau was another one. And this Kappa Sigma thing kept coming up with all of them. As a matter of fact, by the time they got around to making Star Wars SDI, they dubbed their facilities Kappa Sigma Tau. So I started to get curious about that. Here is William Frederick Rockwell Jr., Willard Frederick, the son, Kappa Sigma Hall of Honor, inducted 2009, Pennsylvania State. This group is unusual because of the kind of esoteric imagery that they use for that particular fraternity. And we're going to find some deep people like, astronauts and others who belong to this fraternity. And it's interesting to try to connect those dots because when we get into it, it's a very esoteric piece, and even the origination of it is mysterious once it comes to America from Europe. A couple of interesting things about Willard Sr. Again, back to the colonel. His son, Al Rockwell, the head of Rockwell International, put together a small group and bought Cat Key, which is right there off Bimini. And eventually it became a private club owned by members, as it is today. Now, and they have a statue there of the colonel. Now, this location, of course, buried right in the middle of the hot zone. Let's see. Here we have it. And if you're looking now, we've got Andros is here. And then Cat K right there, along with Bimini. Can't be missed. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing that he's buying up pieces of Bimini, and he just buys Cat Key outright and makes it a kind of a yacht club. Now, remember, this is someone who's aware of the Casey readings. He's aware of the Bimini readings. He's aware of the Poseidon temple. He's aware of the Two-Eye Stone piece, and the Two-Eye Stone, again, being this major power source, crystal power source that was powering the Atlanteans and gave them that advantage. It gave them the ability to go into space, to fly through mountains, and quite remarkable, the things that Casey attributed to it. So these guys are looking at it from a technological point of view, and they're very advanced on their own end of things, but they're thinking, if we can extrapolate what's going on here with the Atlantean technology back then, we'll be that much ahead of the other guy. So there's a very deep piece that's associated with this that has to do with the advanced technology. And Rockwell, working with the Casey readings, appears to be right in the heart of it. But then this is a guy who's going to go on to create, the Apollo missions and SDI Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative in space, which is going to zap those missiles, which we know from people like Philip Corso and others was actually basically a gigantic UFO defense installation. So we're taking ourselves into this kind of much deeper level of understanding when it comes to the space program and when it comes to some of these islands there in the hot zone, exactly what the function is. And also, why is it that we have so many things relating to space right there off the Florida coast. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep, deep tonight. This is X Series 143. It is UFOs in the hot zone, and UFOs come up very, very suspiciously right off the bat when we get into the hot zone. Of course, we're taking your questions tonight in the second half of the program. Miss Olivia is putting those together now. How are we doing out there?
Doing great. Brad Briggs said the North American Rockwell logo is prominently displayed in Spielberg's Close Encounters.
Well, now that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. It would make sense. They were so dominant in space at that point. And there's a reason why there's a shakeup with this, and how they have to kind of they have to redevelop their image from the ground up because of the Challenger disaster. And so a lot of the things that are happening now with SpaceX, for example, the privatization of space, thriving on that level. What's actually interesting about it is they were perched to do it in the early 80s. They were all set to do it. And then the Challenger threw off their plans. And that's very interesting too, because there may have been groups that didn't want them to do it at that point. And those are the same groups that want that dominance in space now, because remember, the entire plan of this, when you're talking about the X-Protect group and all the rest of it, is to run things on the ground from above. That's basically an occult principle, but it's an actual physical description of what so much of this is about. And we see it. So much of our world is dominated this way now through satellites and LEO technology. So when we're looking at that, GPS and everything else, our world is controlled by it there. But then when you get to weapons and all the rest of it, that's a whole different level of subjugation and harvesting that takes place. So we have to kind of open our eyes as to what this development was all about, and how some of the people who were involved with it originally may have been thinking, this will swing into an X-share type of scenario. But it turned out that X-Protect just dominates and continues to dominate. And so much of the piece that's going on with Elon Musk and SpaceX, it's a complete dominance in space. And, this guy's buying up Twitter and doing all this stuff. For me, I've put myself on the record in relation to this. I like to see free speech celebrated. And so anything that's a move, even if it's a caricature, then I think it's a good thing. But I don't for a second think that Musk is anything but a piece of that military industrial complex. And when you get into this,
he would not be allowed to operate otherwise.
Well, yeah,
it's simple.
That's absolutely true. So the question, I think, for tonight, when we look at that, there's not going to be a whole lot of focus on Musk, but this is where this program has led up to. And what you're going to find is that the very group that Rockwell started, Astrotech, they're the ones who are getting all of those Streamlink satellites up into space for SpaceX. So this thing comes right back through all the development that they were doing in the 60s to go to the moon to get us to the SpaceX moment. And I think that is kind of the crucial piece. But before we dive into it, and there is a whole thing on Star Wars technology, it's more than a fantasy. I want to go back even further still, all the way back. And I can almost hear the music as we go back and see it. I want to go back to 1897 and 1898, because a few things are definitely out of place when it comes to hot zone UFOs. And I go back to it and wonder, is this the foundation of some of the technological moves at a very early stage? All right. We know a lot about these airships and the airship sightings that took place in 1897 and 1898. They were, in fact, some of the first UFO major sightings that were reported. And in America, these were widespread reports. So whoever it is that was doing this, enough people saw it on the ground that you couldn't just say, oh, somebody made it up or whatever. there are hundreds and hundreds of reports on this in hundreds of newspapers at the time. And there are researchers who've gone through it. Jim Marrs did an excellent job around this. There's guys like Walter Bosley who go into the whole Sonora Aero Club and all these types of things. You know, so there's some reference there that's long before the Wright brothers with all this stuff going on. Some of the images that come out of those newspaper accounts are pretty hardcore for the era, because you don't have anything flying around up there. So when you see this stuff, it's quite a deal. Now, there's a book called Solving the 1897 Airship Mystery. And I'm just going to read a couple of segments here that have to do with someone named William H. Hart, who was the Assistant Attorney General of California at the time. When these ships start showing up, he comes out and says, I'm connected with the group that's running these things, which is a weird thing to say. And in the San Francisco Caller, which is a newspaper at the time, November 25th, this is 1896 now, a few years after, there's another wave that kicks in. It's reported that former Attorney General William Hart admits his new responsibilities for representing the airship inventor and his interests. William H. Hart made public announcements of patent applications and other business matters pertaining to the airship inventors. In this article, Mr. Hart stated that the purpose of the airship is to travel to Cuba to bomb targets in Havana. This is undoubtedly the origination of all the stories are considering the airship's Cuban destination, for throughout the remainder of the airship sightings, newspapers across the country continued to speculate that the airship was headed for Cuba. This is quite interesting. So the 1897 Airship Mystery, there's one that people start tracking particularly, and they're wondering, what is the deal? And is this representing a fleet, or these, you know, what's going on with this group? And now the hint is that they're going to Cuba. Now, at the time, the United States was not at war with Cuba. And we would have a war with Spain over all this. But the idea basically is, this is coming rather out of the blue, that the airships are being connected with Cuba. And let's go a little bit deeper with it now. Was the United States military interested in using airships for bombing? One newspaper referenced a bill of lading from a New York port concerning one military ship bound for Cuba and laden with one experimental airship. It is known that the U.S. Army was trying to develop an airship at a facility near Denver, Colorado. I suspect any experimental airship packed away in military cargo vessel. Basically, the follow-up on that is that he's saying, you know, this is a secret mission that's going on there. Next up, on the moonless night of February 15th, 1898, after most of the crew had retired for the night, the American battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, Cuba, with the loss of 270 American men. It's major. No unusual sounds were heard just before the explosion. Although Spain had no means for delivering a torpedo to the Maine's hull, the newspapers claimed the Spanish military was responsible for torpedoing the battleship. So there's this whole thing. McKinley gets involved in it, and he was not in favor of a war, but that's what we got. They declared war on Spain. Now, this writer says, isn't it an odd coincidence that Dr. Solomon Andrews demonstrated for the War's Department consideration in September 1863 a motorless, noiseless airship seemingly capable of delivering ordnance to ground or water targets? And isn't it another odd coincidence a fellow by the name of Rich experimented dropping torpedoes by balloons in February of 1897? Rich performed his torpedo experiments in the great state of Iowa. Perhaps Cuba was the intended destination of the airships were bound for after all. Now, so this guy's connecting it up with what happened the next year. But there is a hint here from the California Assistant Attorney General and from other witnesses. It's not just him. Other witnesses actually say that the airship announces that it's going to Cuba. So I guess there's some kind of loudspeaker and they're hearing this. And they say as it gets close to the ground, you can hear them better. And when they go further up, you can hear them less. So that's odd. That's a lot different than like a regular flying saucer sighting, for example. Now, we're getting a very early link of Cuba and the airship mystery. So we've got an experimental advanced technology flying over the United States. And through this public official and through newspapers and rumors, Cuba is the target of the whole thing. And it is suggested, again, the Assistant Attorney General suggests that they're going to bomb Havana, in fact. And there was a lot going on in terms of unrest in Cuba at the time. But nonetheless, we weren't at war, as I said, at that point. It happened a year later that we were at war with Spain. But this idea that we would be bombing Cuba is very strange. So we have an early linking up that suggests the hot zone and the advanced technology together there. We move up a little bit and we go to Thomas Townsend Brown, who is a remarkable scientist that the government dragged into a number of their black projects. And he's definitely someone who's trying to move the culture in this other direction. And he gets disturbed by the military uses. But very early on, he's on board and he is sent to Cuba to kind of observe and take part in these experiments having to do with deep submersion off the west coast of Cuba. And a lot of weird things happen. This is 1930. When he gets there, there's an earthquake, for example. But now I had an opportunity to speak and get to know with some of the relatives of T.T. Brown, including his daughter. And one of the interesting things that came out there was that when he went there, when he got on board, he was set to have these plans to meet this gentleman who was hanging out there off the coast of Cuba on a yacht called the Caroline. Now, we've done pieces around what they kind of referred to it as the Caroline Group. And this is part of this hot zone network that I've pieced together in my own research, included John Kennedy, Ernest Hemingway, and T.T. Brown. But this other piece of it, this very early piece, is interesting. And when he gets on that yacht, when he meets the owner of the yacht, the first thing that he wants to show him is this very interesting original version of Alice in Wonderland. And it's in this glass case. And right away, Townsend Brown asks him, what is it doing in the case? And he said, well, this is the actual first edition. And he says, if this yacht ever turns over, someone will find this floating in the water somewhere. It'll be preserved, basically. And he spoke with a kind of reverence of this original version of Alice in Wonderland, which sets up so much of T.T. Brown's life. I'm going to read some of those quotes from T.T. Brown about this later. What I want to do is continue with this timeline. So early on, I mentioned that Edgar Cayce was giving these readings having to do with Poseidia and this two-eye stone of the Atlanteans. That takes place between 26 and 32. So we have that early airship period around Cuba. We have the whole World War I piece that comes in. But then when you're getting into the 20s, you're starting to get this crisscross again about Bimini and Cuba having to do with advanced technology or something ancient. There's a major kind of intersection of this. Now let's include another personality who, like I said, is featured in the very heart of these hot zone reports, and it's Ernest Hemingway. Now, Hemingway in particular is important because he's associated with both Bimini and Cuba. And we also know, of course, he's a legendary novelist and just incredible, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and all these culturally significant books that, many people consider him the greatest writer of all time. Certainly John Kennedy said he was the greatest American writer of all time. but Hemingway was very interesting because he's very defiant. He's involved with a lot of different types of politics. He gets himself involved in the wars. He gets blown up over in Africa. And he's somebody who's really living the life. He's not just writing about it. And what happens is his mother gets very involved. If you can kind of see through the background and find these details, you're going to find that Hemingway's mother was very involved with the Caseys. And so when we're getting Casey giving these readings from 1926, 32 and beyond about Bimini, we're finding Ernest Hemingway moving to Bimini in the 1930s and then moving to Cuba after that, and then becoming obsessed with peering into the bottom of the ocean along his very interesting and kind of scientifically equipped boat. It's not equipped with weapons. It's equipped with science equipment. And when he gets asked, why are you so obsessed with the bottom of, the ocean here between Cuba and Bimini? And this is more like in the late 30s and early 40s. And he easily can say, well, I'm looking for German U-boats. We're going to find that answer doesn't hold up very well and is a very odd thing, actually, because the boat, as I said, isn't equipped with any weapons. Interestingly enough, when we get around Hemingway, again, we get this hint that he's working with a different intelligence unit than what the United States had at that time, in that early period before the CIA would be the OSS. So there's something else. There's a different type of intelligence network. And these people seem to have this link into the whole hot zone piece. We're going to find out exactly how this surfaces and why UFOs are related in the heart of all this in the hot zone. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep tonight into that deep enigmatic mystery of the hot zone. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly in the second half of the program. And I also want to remind you, while I have your attention, especially if you're new, to go ahead and sign up for the Dark Journalist newsletter, which is a free newsletter and keeps us in touch together with all the social media censorship that's going on. Forget it. And but basically, it'll give you all the exciting shows that we have coming up for you and interviews. We have some great ones coming up with Dr. Farrell. Of course, Gigi Young is coming back. And just an amazing set of interviews coming up here over the next few weeks. Yes.
Simone Nyman says, do you think aliens are interested in Bimini and have access to information through Thomas Townsend Brown?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that David Zink talks about how he was one of the deep explorers in the 70s and 80s around the Atlantis question, and he found all kinds of incredible things. And he used, he was very equipped scientifically, and he worked with Cousteau and all these other people, but he used psychics. He did a lot of psychic archaeology down there, which I think gave him an edge. But the thing that he said was that the natives were so used to UFOs coming out of the water that they had a nickname for them, which was fireflies. So when you think about them being so accustomed to it that they were like, oh, well, there goes another one. That's pretty interesting. And he saw a good deal of it when he was down there. What's interesting, too, I would say, is there's a lot of sightings that came out of Guantanamo Bay, and people who had retired later would come on board and say, I saw this craft, I saw this type of thing. And I have some of the drawings tonight of some of the craft that they were looking at. And it is quite remarkable. One of the guys who I found particularly interesting, who had worked at Guantanamo, he had been somebody who had formerly worked at AUTEC. And AUTEC is such a core piece to this because AUTEC is our underwater Area 51. Done shows on AUTEC, and they interface right there in the hot zone. They're on Andros Island, and they're off the coast of Cuba. Their position at Andros is very interesting because Andros is very, it's almost uninhabited. But it's strategically close to Bimini and Cat Key and all the rest of it. And all the things that they're doing under there, it's very easy to keep under wraps. We're also going to discover that some of these ruins that were rising there in the hot zone between Bimini and Cuba, we really got rolling with them once we got our space program and satellites going, because we could look down, peer down, and see it. And it made all the difference. So, when we're there in 1962 observing these nuclear missiles going into Cuba, we've been looking for something else while all that's happening. And we just happened to catch that. And what we're going to find out in this program is that the same people who are giving that satellite photography analysis to President Kennedy, they are the same ones who are doing the deep UFO analysis for CIA Blue Book. And that's all information that needs to come out, not the fluff that we get from Arrow and other groups in the government now saying, we're examining, we had 510 UAP sightings. And they're like, we're destigmatizing the whole thing. Expose what you've been doing behind closed doors with X-Protect. Don't give us this fluff story, on top, and tell us that.
Yeah, and admit to stigmatizing it first. Right. Don't just destigmatize it.
Right. How about the fact that the CIA stigmatized it in the first place?
Yes.
Yeah. Using its, attack poodle media to do it. I mean, the whole point about getting these things on the record is being real about the whole thing and not accepting this very low potency bar that they're setting, As a matter of fact, I tend to get nervous when those people want to talk about these subjects because they're planning to use the public's own interest against them. And that's always a bad position. What do you got out there?
So more hot zone questions?
Sure.
Okay. So Andy B wants to know, DJ, is there anything especially dangerous for any of us living in the hot zone?
Well, not if you don't get in the middle of AUTEX operations. I think you'd be okay. No, if anything, it's like there's so much going on around you in relation to what they're looking for, things that they're testing underwater. They're certainly testing the UFO technology underwater there at Andros, no question about it. And so all those people around Bimini and Berry Islands and all that stuff, they're going to see unusual things. I've definitely had quite a few emails, and people have sent me video and images down there in the hot zone. And there's no question in my mind that it's one of the most active places in the world for our own study from a government level, but also natural activity of these things. And it becomes very important to sort it out. But at the heart of the X technology, again, it resides inside the UFO file. Whatever it is that the Teslas of our world or the Keeleys in that period of the turn of the century were developing, it has an interface with the UFO file and the effects, the apotheum effects that the UFO creates to kind of turn the physics world upside down and make it unreasonable, unrecognizable. This is an old action, the thing about apotheum. It's something that took place in Atlantis, and this is what we get from the mystery schools. This is what we actually hear if we can read between the lines in the Plato tale, angering the gods and, being destroyed in a day and a night and all these types of things are a way of saying, well, there's something that just defied all normal protocol of what we were used to. And, so what was this all about? And the technology that was acquired, it involved a kind of spirituality. This is the really important place that we come up to in our own technological progress, which is, when you get around the atomic bomb and you get around things like that, you are at a certain physical level of mastery to be able to do things. But of course, there is not only ethical questions and other things about it, but there's a spiritual, psychospiritual aspect connected with it. And this is the piece that they're starting to discover, I think, in relation to the UFO file. So we're going to get into that further. I want to mention this because I do think it's important about Star Wars and where this group was coming from, and how the very group, Rockwell International, that created Star Wars, which was a huge game changer, and let me tell you, is something that fundamentally changed the dynamic between us and whoever is operational in the crafts that aren't ours. Okay, so some of the people involved in this fraternity, the Kappa Sigma Tau, Ted Turner. There's a name that ricochets
disturbing.
with all kinds of Depop, just overflowing
Implications, yeah.
with ideas like that. Willard F. Rockwell, Alpha Delta. Now, he came out of Penn State. That's also interesting because we know from the Casey work, and I'm going to read that exact reading here, that he said, well, look, they're discovering parts, the kind of almost like the portable version of the Two Eyes stones. And these firestones that they find in Yucatan, this is part of the Atlantean technology, they're going to bring them to Penn State. And he actually specifies who, like exactly what archaeologist is working there and how it's going to go to the Penn State Museum. So, and there's a number of interesting alumni up there. And I think that the astronauts in particular are interesting. Take a look at this logo. Kappa Sigmas are taught to live their lives by the star and the crescent, which are the symbols of the fraternity that make up the official badge. The star and crescent shall not be worn by every man, but only by him who is worthy to wear it. He must be a gentleman, a man of honor and courage, a man of zeal, yet humble, an intelligent man, a man of truth, one who tempers action with wisdom, and above all else, one who walks in the light of God. And yet, look at the logo.
What?
I mean, if you had a look at that logo, you'd have to think to yourself, I mean, it looks like it's coming from a very occult, demonic type of piece. Now, there are interesting things in this logo, too, if you take a good look at it. I just want to point out that the X steganography with the keys is something that you find in all the mystery schools, and you'll find it in early tarot cards and all the rest, and in Crowley and all the rest. And that is on this side, which is where we have the keys forming an X, and then over here, the swords forming an X, and then right in the middle, the skull and crossbones piece, which you'll also see in our favorite Skull and Bones. So we've got a weird overhang here of the language, which is you're going to be a gentleman, you're going to be great, you're going to be all this stuff. And then you have very, very, very heavy, occult imagery that suggests that kind of pentagram. But not just, the regular pentagram, but like a very hardcore sort of demonic version, which is odd, I would say. And not all imagery can be sized up that way, because a lot of imagery I find that gets that tag, like a lot of the Freemasonry imagery isn't necessarily coming from a demonic place. I think there's too much of the superstition around that. It needs to be sorted out what's what in that. And so when you get left-hand path works, it has to be easier to see that imagery separated from other groups working along a different line. Okay. Star Wars technology, it's more than a fantasy. This is 1985, the Ronald Reagan era. This is the real era of Rockwell developing SDI for Reagan. Hidden in the rocky canyons of Santa Susana Mountains outside Los Angeles is the nearest thing to a Star Wars laser base anywhere in the Western world. Its code name, Sigma Tau. That's the code name that they're using. This is as close to weaponization and as far from the laboratory as you're going to see without full-scale development, said Bill Robinson, director of the laser programs for Rockwell International Corporation, which began Sigma Tau secretly for the Air Force in 1976. I also want to point out in relation to lasers that what Casey is describing for how the two-eye stone does what it does, it basically is a gigantic laser interface. And he says this type of technology is going to be discovered in 1958, and that's when we get the laser. 2 years earlier at the same site, Rockwell used its own money to start building a higher energy laser called Rachel, which the corporation describes as the forerunner to Star Wars, or as it is officially designated, the Strategic Defense Initiative, for which the government is proposing to spend $30 billion in the next 5 years. Back then, that's a lot. The Strategic Defense Initiative research grew out of a speech given by Reagan in March 1983, in which he proposed that scientists and engineers design a defensive shield to render nuclear weapons obsolete. What's interesting is in the Corso testimony, somebody who's very deep in the UFO file, he came out and said, actually, that was SDI was intentionally put in place to defend against UFOs. Now, it's interesting because he goes back to 1960 when we had Walter Dornberger, the ex-Nazi scientist, through paperclip designing the X-15. And this is a real good example of the X technology being paraded out there. The X-15 is still the fastest manned flight in history, and that was done in 1959 and 1960. Now they have planes that can go faster, but the manned space flight, it just, for a space plane, that still holds the record, which is quite remarkable because it's 60 years later. Dornberger, very deeply involved on a number of levels with this X-Protect group. Now, what's interesting that comes out of the Corso work is he says, what we used that X-15 for was chasing UFOs. That's what it was designed to do. And this is really interesting because the other thing about the X-15 that is not widely known is that Rockwell developed it. So we have Rockwell right in the heart of that X technology, and the design is for chasing UFOs. Well, here they are in the heart of the Star Wars design. And again, it's related to, on the surface, it has an ostensible purpose to shoot down missiles that would be incoming from the Russians. But as it turns out, according to Corso, who was in a position to know, no, it was for a totally entirely different purpose, which I think, gives us the heft of Rockwell again. A little more on the Rockwell side. Part of Rockwell International's mission is to demonstrate how to build lasers whose resonators, a component that helps extract intense beams of light from chemical reactions, are compact cylinders instead of long, narrow tubes. And so it goes on and on with this intense description technologically. Today's Sigma Tau and its support equipment take up acres of land resembling a small oil refinery rather than a feasible space-based anti-missile program. This is basically a battleship environment to test the physics. So this whole thing is like a lab to figure out the Apotheon piece. And there's no question, there's a lot of the reversed engineered UFO technology that went into this piece and this development. So I think we get an idea there, and then you're going to find Reagan giving all these speeches with Rockwell and going around all the Rockwell plants and being like, you're doing a great job and all the rest of it. What we understand from that period is that they had spooked Reagan by showing him these craft that were out there and who were basically, separating, joining together, and refueling in the rings of Saturn. And there are scientists who had studied it, who came out before they died and said, yeah, this is what we briefed Reagan on. So Reagan takes that whole mentality into his later presidency, and we have him at the UN making those unusual comments about the world getting together to fight an alien menace. Interestingly enough, and I've pointed this out about Gorbachev, he's somebody who came forward in 2014 in public and said, when Reagan went to meet me, he wanted to know if we would help him, basically fight incoming hostile UFOs. And he was dead serious. And Reagan took him aside, and it was just Reagan and the interpreter and Gorbachev. So Reagan, getting him together on that is one thing, and I think it's very important. But the other piece that's interesting there is that Gorbachev is, letting this out, because Gorbachev knew also, we can't keep these things wrapped up. And he's somebody who also demonstrated a depth by wanting to reduce the nuclear weapons piece. And Reagan and Gorbachev, in fact, started some of the deepest reductions and reduced certain levels of weapons that had never been reduced before. So we're squandering that by getting into this Ukraine thing and sending the amount of money and military aid. And it's not like we're sending food over there. It's really like, hey, look, here's another boondoggle for Lockheed Martin. So that needs to be put in a proper perspective, given the history around that. Yeah, what do you got?
We were just checking whether Elon Musk went to UPenn.
Interesting.
And Death Eater says Elon Musk, quote, 2 years later, he transferred to the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, where he completed studies for a Bachelor of Arts degree in physics and a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the Wharton School. I guess Musk claims he earned the degrees in 95, but UPenn maintains it awarded them in 97.
Isn't that interesting? Who is he sending in? Yeah, well, look, UPenn plays right into the heart of this. Let's find out why, actually. Let's read into what the ruins aspect was all about. A couple of quick things to keep us all on the same page. All right, that's the hot zone. This is the original graphic that we're working with on this. And you have these points. That's Bimini over here, and then the western tip. That's where Polina Zalitsky discovered the Cuban city. Now, the other thing I think is worth noting, that's Yucatan, where the Casey story has the Atlanteans going and forming another Atlantis. And part of this Hall of Records story of the Atlanteans placing their technology and their records into these different libraries and different facilities. This is, there's 3 places in the earth, according to Casey, where this happens. One is under the Sphinx. That's the major Hall of Records, but the records are all the same in each location. The other one is in Bimini, right off the coast, and the other is in Yucatan, which a lot of researchers think is in Guatemala, and we'll get into that. Let's get Casey's story about this. And how are we doing on time here? Yeah, so we'll go through this for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. How does that grab you? Okay, fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight in X Series 143. This is the UFO File and the Hot Zone, and we'll be taking your questions here shortly. Let's go ahead and find out what Casey was talking about. Here's the Casey story. That there was a great continent of Atlantis that on one side was the Gulf of Mexico and on the other was the Mediterranean. There have been lots and lots of people trying to say, well, there's, Atlantis was in China, or Atlantis was here, or, all over the place. It's very particular in the Plato account that is passed down through Solon, that he gets it from the Egyptian priests who've held on to it for 7,000 years. And the upshot is very simple. They say it stretched out and it was beyond the Straits of Heracles. So that's the Rock of Gibraltar, and that spreads out into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's where he's talking about. The mystery schools talk about it on one side, the Mediterranean, on the other side, the Gulf of Mexico. In the middle is the gigantic Atlantean continent. So that's the actual historical perspective from Plato and the mystery schools. That's what we're talking about. Now, when they split into groups of islands and when they hit sort of hard times, the Atlanteans take off and dominate other areas and things of that nature. But the Atlantean story and the destruction of Atlantis and the Two-Eye Stone and the Poseidon peace with the Emilius group fighting the sons of Belial, that's all taking place on the continent there. So, and the peace, the final stretch of Atlantis that survives before the major destruction is there in that area in Bimini. And that's the last kind of major piece of it. And it's interesting because I remember Polina Zalitsky, who was the oceanographer who discovered the city off the coast of Cuba, and massive. I mean, it was a massive discovery. How this thing ever gets thrown aside, or you don't even hear about it. They do all these shows in Atlantis. They don't even mention her or this incredible discovery because it's that covered up. And I saw this, very deep research piece on Bimini. They don't even mention Edgar Casey in relation to the Bimini Road. And it's ridiculous. He predicted that it was going to be there. Where's the context for these stories? I don't know where you're supposed to get this. Let me put it to you this way. Before Casey mentioned Bimini, nobody knew anything about it in relation to Atlantis, so all that is out of the Casey work. And to leave that out is absurd. So that gives us an idea of the geography. Okay, now let's talk about the technology. So Casey is suggesting that the Atlanteans could do anything with their mind, and that their mind is basically projected through these power stations, and the power stations consist of these 2-eye crystals, and that the amplification of the things that they think about they can achieve. That's basically fundamentally where it's coming from. And he's also talking about them having the ability of using that technology to connect with the realm of the saints, the outer spheres, as he refers to it. So they're using it on one side of Atlantis for, you open up your laptop and you connect with the ascended master. And the other group is using it and thinking, the Belial group is thinking they can dominate the populations around them with it. And so you have a kind of martial philosophy on one hand, and then this very enlightened thing on the other, and they start to clash, and then they start to war with each other using this technology. So that spells real problems, and that's where the echo of this Atlantean piece comes from. In Casey's retrocognitive version of this story, he's going back 200,000 BC, and then it all comes tumbling down around 10,000 BC. So that's 190,000 years of activity. And during that period, we become more hardened into materiality. The Atlanteans are walking around completely with their third eye active. So they're completely psychic, and they can experience things on multiple levels. It's interesting, even when Casey is talking about the Egyptian civilization, he says it's very hard for us to conceive of how in tune they were with nature and the universe and everything else, because they would walk around and be aware of activities that were going on 10 miles above them. So that's very strange to consider, that kind of level of sense awareness. So when we see them going into, the depictions of Horus and all these other things, they're really living in a different environment in a sense. They're very spiritually connected. They're connected to the astral plane. And that's why there's a difficulty for us. For us, it just looks like this kind of incredible magic when we look back there. But nonetheless, there's a pattern there that we're connected to, and there's a history rising in relationship to this. And this is what there's a battle behind the scenes over the acknowledgement of this, the history of this, the records of this, and finally the archaeology itself. That's where the whole archaeological wars concept in the middle of this comes from. We're going to get into that here. So we go a little bit deeper again to take a good look. So that's Bimini that's circled. We got NASA there in the heart of things. Casey says that this Iltar character he's like the Noah figure in the Casey story. And he takes the knowledge of the Atlanteans and he goes from Poseidia, which is sinking, and he's trying to warn everybody, but they don't pay attention. And at the end, he's just taking off. And there's this segment of Mayan art here that's showing us this volcano going off in the background. That's the destruction of Aztlan, as it were. But Iltar goes off to Yucatan, and he develops another culture that's very much like this version of Atlantis that they had at the end of Poseidia, and he creates the Hall of Records there. So it's buried somewhere there in the Yucatan area, and Casey specified it was in Yucatan, but in the period that he's talking about, they say so much as Yucatan that researchers later wondered, I wonder if this is Guatemala, the area that he's talking about, given his descriptions. Casey, it has to be said, has pinpointed really miraculous things in his readings. One of the things that he said was that at one point the Nile River flowed out into the Atlantic, which everyone thought was kind of a joke. And then when they started doing the satellite mapping, they found very ancient outlines of this. So whatever it was that Casey was doing, the state that he was getting into, he was able to connect in this state. Now we know that in the regular psychic state that he was in, he could give readings, and he would be, giving health readings and giving diagnoses. So his story and how it's connected to all this is quite miraculous. And I think, we've covered it pretty extensively on the show. But what I want to say about Casey in relation to this Atlantis story is he's suggesting that we rediscover this piece of Atlantis because we've entered into a similar period, and that the knowledge of what we did there in that earlier period is going to help us. And this is part of the discovery. And so this is the openness of the mystery schools, the Casey work, theosophy, anthroposophy, this piece opening us up to our own past. And that raises our own awareness about it, as opposed to, some group telling us what our history is, or you descended from apes, or whatever they want to make up. If you watch the Gigi Young Martian series, the thing that they're leaning toward there is, they're going to be discovering some ruins on Mars that will prove that we're actually related to these Martian aliens. It's very interesting stuff. And I think it's hard to sort through. It seems like the Atlantis story is the thing that gives us the key for walking through that path. A little further on that, there's a guy out there who's from the ARE who does a lot on the mound builders now, Dr. Little. And it's an interesting thing because he's done some books on Atlantis and stuff, but the research he's doing on the mound builders, I guess, is going to come out at some future point, but he's been sharing a lot of it. And the Casey story of the mound builders, again, just like the Iltar story, is these stragglers, these groups coming out of Atlantis and Poseidia and coming into America to survive. And they become the foundation of the mound builders. And when we think of the mounds, we just think of these covered mounds and all the rest of them. But when they were discovered and, when they did reconstructions and things, those look very much like ancient villages. This is one of them. It's Kincaid mounds. These are in Illinois, but this is kind of like the Atlantean village that they took with them to America. And I think that's where we get that heart of the mound builders activity. And it's very important because, there's so many things about America in relation to Atlantis. This is what Graham Hancock was getting across in his last book. And when he came up here and we did a live event with him, this was a couple of years before his recent Netflix piece. The whole idea was it's Atlantis in America, and we need to think of America as that kind of new Atlantis vessel. How are we doing over there, Miss Olivia?
Doing great. Can I throw you a Casey question?
Yes.
So Amy Thomas wants to know, Casey said it was Poseidia that was rising in Bimini, not Atlantis per se. Did I get that right?
Well, Poseidia is a part of Atlantis. And so when you get the destructions, there's 3 destructions in Atlantis, according to Casey. So the first one happens, he gives the actual date because they asked him for once to specify. And he said it's 50,722 BC. And the first disaster happens because they're being overrun basically by dinosaurs. Now, this is weird. Because, the traditional record is, hey, dinosaurs were out 65 million years ago. So what's going on here? And it is quite odd. And yet we have those findings in the Mayan villages, and we've done episodes on those where they have people kind of riding what look like small dinosaurs and things. So exactly what was going on there is interesting. There's a suggestion in some of the readings that if you really read between the lines, it almost sounds like the Atlanteans did a Jurassic Park type thing, brought this upon themselves. And he'll say things of this nature by interfering with courses in nature and projecting their will. You're reading, this is like, oh, it's a scientific project. But in any case, all the groups get together in the world and they meet in the heart of Atlantis, and they decide to use what he said is similar to what they call a death ray now. And if you look at what the death ray was, that was a big Tesla beam idea to protect the United States from an invasion. And it's pretty interesting when you're looking at Casey and how he's trying to lay this out. But basically what we're getting is that they had this advanced technology and they attempted to do this, but the original destruction was caused by them doing this, and it split the island into 3. And he calls the islands Arian, Og, and Poseidia. Poseidia is the group that is very dedicated to the Amelius group, and the Belial group seems to dominate on the other side. So Poseidia is the island that survives the longest and is in the middle of the battle with the Belial group of Arian and Og. Poseidia is exactly in the hot zone, that whole piece, and that whole thing about the Bermuda Triangle, those directly overlap. So this idea that eventually what happens is the two eye stones get distorted and they pull everything down. And that we have these incredible magnetic disruptions in the Bermuda Triangle and planes flying into clouds and disappearing and things like that. That this is dimensional portals, and it's getting on a whole different level of physics based on the fact that this apotheum, this great apotheum, took place back there in 10,500 BC. The second destruction he lists is 28,000 BC. So 50,000, 28, and then 10,500 BC. And there's leftover, there's kind of aftershocks, but that's basically it. And if you compare that with the records of the Ice Age and the different things and the levels of the seas rising, you start to get a picture that we had a whole civilization back there. That's what Graham Hancock is so good at doing. He's saying, look, this is what took place in this one period. Things are getting a lot older every day, doesn't it seem? And now we have these civilizations where if you argued in, for example, 2010, that there was a civilization around 10,000 BC that was just as advanced as something like the Egyptians, they could laugh you off and say, well, we don't have any evidence for that. But things like Göbekli Tepe and others have changed things, those discoveries. And there's no question that they've resisted this because they don't want to revise for the plebes the story. But I'm absolutely committed to the idea that they know quite well that this stuff goes much further back. And that's the most shocking kind of disclosure as we get into this. It's not UFO disclosure, that's for sure. The disclosure of our own advanced culture back in that period is unbelievable. It's off the charts, especially given the nature of the sort of universal powers of the Atlanteans. They're psychic, they are technologically advanced, they're spiritually, the Amelius group is spiritually in tune, using the technology to connect to the saintly realm. And they prepare a whole priestess lineage to do this. So, we're looking at a culture which, when you look later at the Babylonians or the Mayans, they're all trying to recapture what the Atlanteans did. And I guess, in a sense, that's what we're trying to do here tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 143. This is the HotZone, the UFO HotZone file. And we're going deep here. I got a couple more things to present, and then we're going to take your questions, and I'll try to just sprinkle in the rest. I wanted to give some idea of some of these craft that have been seen around Cuba. This one I found interesting. It's a sketch, but the guy who drew it was a doctor who saw this off the coast of the western tip of Cuba coming out of the water. And he said it looked like on the top and the bottom it was a torch. It almost looked like it was flaming, and it came out of the water and then disappeared. There's so many reports having to do with Cuba. And at a certain point, the Americans were observing in the late 60s a Cuban fighter going up to investigate a UFO and getting shot down by trying to attack the UFO. So there's a lot there locked in the archives dealing with Cuba. And by the way, there's a very intense Cuban astronomical group there, which is also looking into some of the sort of archaeoastronomy that goes around this story of Atlantis and all the rest. Interestingly enough, in the Cuban Revolution, they include the UFO file. And they say if there are, as we get into this, if there are aliens or whatever, we hope that they join in our cause of revolution. I kid you not, that's in there. So there's something down there. They're very aware around the entire subject. Very important to keep in mind. Okay. What you got?
I just love these questions. People are so hungry for wisdom. So Johann Wolf wants to know, DJ, so Iltar is Casey's name for Kukulkan, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha?
Well, it's never identified that way. What he says is that Iltar was the leader who came out of Poseidia, and that he brought a small group with him of about 50 people, and that they rebuilt an entire Atlantean civilization. And what's interesting is after rebuilding it, the Belial group, which is still trying to hang on by a thread themselves, they go after them and they war on them, and they end up the Amelia's group with Iltar goes to Ohio. And when we get the Serpent Mound and all that stuff, I absolutely guarantee you that is an offshoot of this Iltar group. But Iltar builds up the civilization, and he builds the Hall of Records, and that all takes place in Yucatan, which is why I think, again, we get to the Yucatan Peninsula as far as the hot zone goes. Remember, a lot of the reports I got about the hot zone were from government people. And they were people who used to work in the government or used to work for the military or for a private company, and it involved things like mapping the floor of the ocean. And some of it involves seeing things from aerospace companies looking down. And so the idea about the hot zone fundamentally is that you can't, if you see something like an Isis temple down there, you can't say anything about it. So this is interesting too, because there must be a series then of whistleblowers who are aware of this. And, in that sense, like it's much harder when we talk about Antarctica and all the rest to get whistleblowers in that program and what they're seeing over there. In the hot zone, actually, there's probably a lot of people that we know who have worked down there who have seen things and are under this NDA. What I learned about it was that if you were in the military, you could actually be court-martialed if you said anything about it. And I'm sure if some people, there have been instances of people saying, I saw this temple, and they're usually individuals who are explorers or just happen to see something. Some of them are Google Earth people, who find pyramids off the coast of Florida. Some of those cases are very convincing. I mean, we're going to be looking at, over the next 10 years, a remarkable sea change in attitudes about this. I'm absolutely convinced. Yeah.
Mer Bowman, what exactly do we expect to find out in discovering the Hall of Records that we may not know? What might happen if the wrong people find it?
Well, the efforts of the wrong people to find it, I think, is what's at issue with it. There's a massive program to find those, and there's good reason for it, because we don't understand it because it's not raised as any kind of national security issue, or it's not in our political conversation. But discovering a Hall of Records of the Atlanteans is, it's an earthquake in terms of history, in terms of its implications for humanity. There's so many different things there. And for them, these groups want to be on top of it. Egerton Sykes, who is the ultimate Atlantis expert, and he was an ex-British intelligence guy, and he came out with all of this when he left the intelligence service, and he just was an out-and-out Atlantis researcher, and he edited all the classic books like The Antediluvian World by Ignatius Donnelly and these things. But what he generally said was that all of these nations are aware that in that area there are these extensive, and he himself claimed to know the location in the Bahamas of a very heavy-duty Egyptian-style temple, so under the water. And his idea, fundamentally, he didn't want to put it on the level of the Casey hardcore, almost science fiction style abilities of the Atlanteans. This is what's so edgy about the Casey stuff. But Sykes put them more as like, this is like an Egyptian civilization that sank, but they were there. So it changes the whole thing of history. This is how he thought about it. And what's interesting is when he traced through America, he found the names were so linking up with what was in Egypt that basically he felt that it was the Egyptians coming over here and founding the civilization. So we have a lot of those missing chapters in history. What I feel maybe in terms of what would we expect to find, Casey's very clear that the Atlantean initiates left behind something for humanity to understand who they are. But it also involves the development of the Two-Eye Stone. And he actually says the plans for its construction are in there. They left that as well. And this may be something, the Two-Eye part, I don't think is quite understood. But it's come up before that defense, on the Defense Department side, they've looked for things like the weapons that were described in Sumerian wars and things of this nature. So they certainly would have to understand that something like the Two-Eye Stone was a game changer. Rockwell, Willard Rockwell, being a member of the ARE and buying up Bimini, he's getting influenced again by those Casey readings saying this is what happened. And then he winds up doing the Apollo moon missions and Star Wars. So at what point do we just crisscross here that these people are completely aware of the mystery school material? That's, I think, where we're going with that next. Excellent. Okay, so let's do this. Let me just put in a couple of things here, and then we'll go right to questions now. Just so we know a little bit about the UFO players in the middle of this. Well, I guess before I do that, I should read, there's an important piece. I'm going to do a whole episode, actually, on Philos the Tibetan.
Okay.
And this is a classic work that came out, I think it came out in 1906, I'm going to say. But it's a classic work around Atlantis. And what happened with it actually was that there was a young boy in his teens who actually had a very hard time focusing on his school lessons and things. And he gets put upon and channels this incredible information. You know, he gets contacted and he has this incredible experience. Now, what's funny to me about it is how advanced the book is around the Atlantis subject, so that it literally sounds like, you know, some Atlantean person had come in and come through this person. One of the examples of this is the person who's coming through is Philos, and he's basically delivering this information to this very interesting teenager. And eventually the book will come out. That's a picture of Philos, by the way. But, and he looks like, you know, kind of a raga, sort of. And the book is so advanced in terms of the story that it tells around these concepts. And, you know, it's hard to believe and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, I think because it was so advanced, it's somebody's opportunity to try to let these things out. So here's a quote from it. Now, remember, at the time that he was channeling this stuff, they didn't even have flight. When it comes out, they have flight, but he was channeling it about 10 years earlier. We, the Poseidians, knew that the mysterious nations across the waters were possessed of abilities which virtually dwarfed our attainments, such as our power to traverse the aerial or marine depths, our swift cars, our subsurface sea ships. No, they did not boast of such conveniences, but they had no need of them to carry on the course of their lives, and therefore, as we supposed, no desire for such apparatus. Perhaps our scorn was more affected than real, for in our more sober thought we acknowledged with no small admiration their supremacy. What though we could speak with and see and hear and be seen by those with whom we wish to communicate, and this at any distance and without wires, but over the magnetic currents of the globe? Truly, we never knew the pangs of separation from our friends. We could attend to the demands of commerce and transport our armies in war times with a dispatch which would pass around the world in a day. All this as long as our mechanical and electrical contrivances were at hand. But what availed all this splendid ability? Shut one of the most learned Zequai in a dungeon, and all his knowledge would be as naught. He could not be deprived in such a way of the implements or agencies, and hope to see or hear or escape without external aid. His marvelous capabilities were dependent upon the creation of his intellect, And so it goes on this whole story about the Poseidians and the technology that they had and how they had become dependent upon it. And he tells these interesting stories about going to get his airship and stuff. And it's almost like he's walking into the subway to get his airship, and then he takes it underwater and he does all these interesting things. And just the kind of modern quality of the whole thing. And in there, he also talks about, and this is where we get the whole Mount Shasta advanced civilization thing. He talks about how this advanced brotherhood went and rescued themselves and went to Mount Shasta, very much like Iltar went to Yucatan, and that they existed inside of Mount Shasta. There's so many stories about Shasta that it's hard to even get into it, but I think seeing the roots of some of these stories and where they come from is fascinating. But Philos, again, a dweller on two planets, this becomes one of those books, which is very telling and gives us that hint of what's going on in the background. The Steiner piece from Anthroposophy, I also want to bring this in here so we understand when you're getting into the hot zone, like what are you talking about when you get into the Atlantean piece? A quick quote here from Steiner's observation, and Steiner working very closely around this Atlantis story in the book Cosmic Memory. But he says something interesting in one of his descriptions that I think is worth noting here about what we can get in terms of information about this period and what we can't. Let's see. Okay. For the present, it is not permitted to make public communication about the origin of the dark knowledge of these arts that the Atlantean sorcerers had. A passage from the Akashic Chronicle must therefore be omitted here, as though and this is interesting to me. So Steiner gives this whole thing about how the culture of Atlantis was darkening and how they had become kind of supreme black magicians on the Belial side. And that they get to such a point that he actually breaks off the conversation because he doesn't want us to know exactly how bad it got. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of the potentiality for these groups around this type of thing. When you get into those power centers, whether it's technological, magical, mystical, whatever it happens to be, there's a level of it at which your soul is at risk. And I think this is where Steiner was giving us that impression. What he talks about is that at a certain point, there's a leader called Manu who takes the 1,000 of the most advanced Atlanteans when he's aware that the culture is faltering and that there's going to be a massive destruction. And he takes them to Asia and they start the Indian culture. Later, Casey will say the Atlanteans come in to Egypt around 10,500 BC. So we have the Atlanteans coming out and informing these other cultures and giving us the whole background on that. So when we get and we reacquire the knowledge of these cultures, we're also getting into a different situation ourselves. Look what our own technological process and progress has brought us. The nuclear knowledge now is almost, secondary to the things that we can do. And, it's really well known that Reagan, when he spoke with Gorbachev, they try to negotiate a zero option for nuclear weapons, which means the level of weaponry had already grown so much that we didn't need nuclear weapons. So, we have to be aware of this when we get into the level of knowledge and the periods that we're going into, that there comes a kind of a huge responsibility that comes with the knowledge around it. And so it's an awakening around those powers that we possessed in the past. So it's kind of a rediscovery of identity. I think that's a good way for us to look at it. Let's take the last piece here and give us a little bit of Thomas Townsend Brown, and then we'll go to your questions.
Sounds great.
How does that go? How are you doing out there?
Doing great. We have some requests to do a show on Mount Shasta.
Well, that would be good stuff. And I couldn't resist it, of course. But there's been a lot of fluff around Mount Shasta. But let me tell you, at heart, it's a very interesting place.
But if anybody has any intel, they can reach out to DJ at admin@darkjournalist.com.
Right. So admin@darkjournalist.com for any information around things generally works really well. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight here on X Series 143. And this is the HotZone UFO file that takes us on one hand into Atlantis, and on the other hand takes us also into the Mystery School, giving us that deeper piece of the history. And then the UFO file sitting there, and then the advanced technology that we find ourselves surrounded by. So we find ourselves in an interesting situation coming up here to 2023 and all the things that we're going to unfold in this year. Obviously, there's a great deal of change that's happening, and we have to make sure that some of the changes and some of that deeper awakening that takes place is actually not interfered with by narratives that are artificially contrived to keep us in this kind of a backward civilization where we've really found ourselves. And I think the level of insight that a person has who's been propagandized by the media and all the rest, and the kind of degraded education culture, you find yourselves really walking around in a kind of a hazardous environment. So what we can do in connecting on this in the ideas room through the information in the X series, we're working with the concepts to, on our own level, on our own scale, improve our knowledge of these things. So we're going to find that people will run over a cliff with some of this stuff, and you do find people imitating the deeper ideas, and you do find marketing groups exploiting that, and you do find intelligence groups pretending to give you UFO disclosure and things of this nature. So those are the types of minefields that I think we attempt to walk through in a period like this, but also remember we're in this kind of reemergence. It's the thing that Steiner talked about, that anthroposophy he felt was failing. Well, not anthroposophy so much, but just the whole mystery schools had failed because World War I had taken place. But as World War I was coming to an end, he said, we're going to get another chance with anthroposophy in 100 years. And this is no question that doorway opening. I can't tell you that when I started doing the X series, you wouldn't hear about the eighth sphere anywhere unless you knew someone who was familiar with the Steiner work. And but it was just not a part of our research dialogue. The harmonic awareness, think about, you can watch a whole series of the stuff. We've had Gigi Young on talking about it. It's taken things to a totally different level. And I think it is that awareness of where we started with it when we we're bringing the concepts out to where it is now. You can see that a lot of the light is coming through, and you're going to be, it's also, there's kind of a chaotic aspect going on out there in the world. So these two things kind of coming together, there's this knowledge emerging and the chaos attempting to engulf us. So these are the things I think that we can really take some of the deeper concepts from the mystery schools and bring them into a higher place. And that might be politics, it could be economics, it can be psychic experience, whatever it happens to be. It's getting things on a different higher level. So that's how we're going to do it. Okay. I wanted to mention something here, and it has to do with how so much of this information around the HotZone UFOs interacts and intersects with political activity. Okay, so I've talked to you about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the HotZone and how that relates to some of the things we're talking about here. So we've got a figure who is around all of these matters, politically, on the UFO front, and also on the HotZone side. And this is this very interesting character, Art Lundahl. And Lundahl showed up in my Cosmos Club episodes. He's a very interesting guy, and I think of him as kind of the head of the UFO Bilderberg there inside the Cosmos Club. So Arthur Lundahl is well known because of his work as part of the National Photographic Institute for the government. And he would do photo analysis when it came to all these different situations. They came to him and said, we need you in the CIA to do this for UFOs, because the CIA was trying to take the UFO file away from the Air Force, which they did. And he became their man, and he became their photo interpreter. And he went through all of the real CIA Blue Book stuff to analyze what was going on. His interesting career spans something like 40 years, and he becomes basically like a key player in that UFO Bilderberg piece. What's interesting, of course, about him and his history is that he is the person who will go to President Kennedy and say, we were looking at Cuba, and guess what we came up with? We came up with all these things of the Soviets moving nuclear missiles into Cuba. Now, it's very interesting to note that when that report comes up, Kennedy doesn't initially agree with it. And he says, are you sure? You know, like, he doesn't want to, this is a major thing that's going on here. And then he's reminded that Lundahl has been working on the UFO file for 15 years. And so that's what gives him the trust to say, oh, okay, you know, this guy is definitely giving us the real deal. But I find that interesting because Lundahl also is somebody who has a two-track life, which is, we know certain things about him, but whenever you're in the CIA, there's a whole different level. All we have to know is that on the CIA side, he's the person who is examining the UFO photos, and that's the secret stuff that they have. CIA documents indicate that the agency monitored the UFO situation starting in 1952. That's the official version. That's ridiculous. They started it even before they were founded. Lundahl's first meeting with the study group was in 1967. That's also wrong. But anyway, Lundahl meets with the Air Force contract team. In 1967, the Air Force issued a contract to the University of Colorado to study unidentified flying objects. And it's very interesting because they have all this work that he performs for the Condon Committee. And what's interesting is the official history around him gets blown away when it turns out that he was involved with doing all this photo analysis during the 1952 wave that happened over the Washington, D.C. White House. Now, in his life, he becomes the person who is watching things from above. But he's stationed in the 1950s looking over the hot zone. And this is where, in my opinion, they get incredibly deep information about that area relating to Bimini and all the rest of it. We'll also find that astronaut Gordon Cooper is given a job of spotting things over Cuba, but then his other piece is to look for ruins there. And what's funny is after he dies, they'll do a whole program about how he kept a record of Spanish galleons. And let me tell you, Spanish galleons is such a cover for hot zone artifacts that, you know, this becomes like a weird shell game that goes on the surface. But we have guys like Lundahl being right at the heart of this UFO Bilderberg in the Cosmos Club on one hand. Two, they're giving Kennedy this information about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Three, they're stationed over Bimini, Cuba, and the hot zone area. They're looking at ancient ruins. So we're finding more and more of these interface characters. I mentioned one of them in a previous episode, and his name is Alvarez, and he was part of the Robertson panel studying UFOs in 1952. Well, when we study his career, they involve him, again, as a photo analyst in the deep research around UFOs for the X-Protect group. Then, after the Kennedy assassination, he's the guy who has to go out and debunk the Zapruder film so that it goes along with the official story. And he doesn't debunk the film, but he says it doesn't show what we can obviously see, which is President Kennedy being shot from the front. Then, in the 1970s, he turns up at the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. And what is he doing? He's using cosmic rays to find secret rooms or vaults under the Sphinx and in the pyramid. So again, this interface of these three things, it's like I have a deep state political signature on one hand. On the other hand, I'm a deep player on the UFO file. On the other hand, I'm involved somehow in this HotZone Atlantis interface piece. The fact that we see the signature on these people over and over again, and Antarctica comes into it as well, because, you know, like Lloyd Berkner, who we studied in the last episode, and like Rockwell today, these are guys who are going around Antarctica for some reason. They're deeply involved with Admiral Byrd. So we're getting closer to this knowledge and understanding about it. One of the things that we find out when we look at SDI and we look at the Star Wars program, it was actually built around the idea of a particle accelerator, which is what we get at CERN. But when they trace the history back of what they were developing the particle accelerators with, if you go back into the original Office of Research and Development and Science in the government, you find, and I went through these, that in 1928, they were doing high voltage studies using the Tesla coil as a particle accelerator. So the whole CERN thing comes out of the Tesla coil. That, when we get into those studies and we see that Lloyd Berkner joins the program shortly afterwards, I can point him out here. And I don't want to throw you off by throwing too many names at you, but I just want to remind you that Berkner is in the last episode. He's the one who is deep in the Robertson panel. He's deep on the UFO side, and he's on the President's Science Council. But I think what we're getting here is a picture of people who, like Alvarez, like Berkner, like Rockwell, and like Lundahl, who are working on this inside corridor for the government. And I think that Condon himself is another one, along with Donald Menzel. There's a group of them, and they have to be the loudest debunkers in public of the subject while studying at the hardest behind the scenes. And this is, I think, a piece of the kind of environment that we find ourselves in around these subjects that we need to be aware of. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to start with the first one. SW711211114. What does Cuba have to do with the hot zone? Let's start there.
Okay, well, it's in the hot zone. So the idea of the hot zone, again, is there are a number of people who work in a particular area between Bimini, Cuba, and the coast of Florida, the Yucatan Peninsula. And if they're working there in an official capacity for a company or for the government, if they see something that is, you know, like a large temple, or is a large set of ruins, like what Polina Zalitsky found off the western tip of Cuba, for example, which was connected originally to Atlantis, then, and remember in the case of Zelensky, she actually went and did a deep sea submersible close up to the temples. And they asked her, they were like, were they like Egyptian hieroglyphs you were seeing? You know, because she mentioned there were hieroglyphs. And she said, no, they were much more like the Mayan culture. So think about that. That really tells us that whatever was there, you know, had that Mayan culture signature, and then went from there to the Yucatan. So, so therefore, Cuba is a big piece of the hot zone activity, and it's also deeply involved in the intrigue around it, because whenever you get around Cuba, you're dealing with the history of Hemingway having been there, and all the research that he was doing on the ruins, which is part of the whole national security incident that we've brought up in this program before, where their document came out of from the Kennedy White House. And this is something that we got in 2015 from 1962. And they were contemplating a national security incident relating to Hemingway's villa there in Cuba. And the whole idea, as it turned out, was that there was a vault there and that they needed to get it out. Later, it was suggested, and this is how you get all of the Hemingway artifacts at the JFK Library. That's the biggest depository of Hemingway writings. It's at the Kennedy Library. How does that make any sense? So this is part of the deeper piece we brought forward on the hot zone, and there's a historical piece there, but Cuba occupies that place as right off the coast there. They've discovered an entire track of that lost continent of Atlantis, and that's the work of Paulina Zalitsky, and we have tried to really spotlight her work. I mean, they gave her a really hard time, including trying to scare her off by putting her in a Mexican prison. So, in a sense, she's moved on with her life and she's doing what she does. But I feel like her great discovery has been left there. And then we go back to this whole thing of, you get these stories of like, hey, somebody found something in the Mediterranean, is that Atlantis? Well, maybe we should go back to the story of 2001 where somebody found a whole city off of Cuba, and we have actual records of the expedition, pictures, and all the rest of it. But, that's a very tricky geopolitical situation because Cuba owns those waters. And so for sure, they're doing their own deep research in that area, and for sure, we're keeping an eye on them. And that game's been going on for a long time. Yes.
Okay. So Fooper Fighter says, so is the Cuban embargo a means of keeping people from snooping around there?
Probably. I think all of the real political problems that we have with Cuba, the major ones, have to do with this aspect of access to those ruins. And I think that they hope that the government in Cuba falls and that they can just roll in there and take over. They've been looking at that scenario for 60 years. There's a deeper geopolitical play during the Cold War Castro period with Cuba and Kennedy and all the rest. But even that, even the Cuban Missile Crisis has some deep issues. It's almost like everybody knows the extra element, who is negotiating, but the public doesn't know anything about it, which is why the whole negotiation around the Cuban Missile Crisis looks so weird. But certainly, you have traditional kind of diplomatic issues and things that come up in relation to it. But I'm trying to point out that if you look at Cuba and the Bay of Pigs scenario and the absolute obsession on the CIA side with it, and then you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then you look at them trying to tie in Oswald with Castro and all the rest of it, that's an awful lot of activity around Cuba. And, I definitely see the Cold War echoes in the situation, but I think because we know the deeper history and that we know there's a city off the coast there, and we know Hemingway was so involved with Cuba and the Atlantis issue, and his mother was close to the Caseys, and then he moved to Bimini because of Casey's prediction about the temple of Poseidon arising there, that there's a deeper piece associated with all of it. That's why we find everything around the hot zone is so intriguing. And it extends to the Bahamas and that whole area and the whole Gulf Stream. Even the strange control around Haiti seems to fall somewhere into positioning around what's going on there. And remember, a lot of this is about land rising, because this is a big tenet inside the Casey readings, inside the mystery schools and other places, that the land that's rising, if it rises in international waters, anybody can claim it. That's why I've gone on record with all those celebrities who bought these different lots there in the Atlantic Ocean, including John Lennon and others, who were expecting this to happen. I've got one of these. I think I have a picture here. That's the picture of the Smithsonian reporting on JFK getting Hemingway's legacy out of Cuba. That's 1961. So that's already on the record. You don't have to guess if I'm right about that. But the other thing, of course, is that Hemingway's brother Les set up New Atlantis. And I have that here somewhere too, but it's lost to history. Oh, here's an interesting thing that I did want to show. There was a whole section on Cat Key. I guess I did mention it, but this is the island where President Nixon would always stay, on Cat Key. And just look at that Very interesting place there. This is another piece where very important negotiations have taken place in the hot zone. And in the Bahamas, President Kennedy had the UK Prime Minister meet him there to do incredible overhaul of the US-UK relationship. So an awful lot takes place there. And now we have all the, everything that happened with Bankman-Fried and all that's all operated out of the Bahamas, and all those banks and everything else. This is all, it's like a lawless, totally different environment. And there's a reason why so many of the regular rules of what we do don't apply there in the hot zone. Something else is operational. And yes, you have drug running. Yes, you have kind of the whole leftover, of the mafia influence there, and you have intrigues and everything, but why is it over and over again, all these stories? They just had this last month, that's Bitcoin innovator guy, and he shows up dead, in the hot zone. And then the whole collapse of FTX last November, that whole thing coming out of the hot zone, and all their addresses are in the Bahamas. I mean, it's like we're talking about a totally different civilization, operational setup down there. And we need to understand why it is the traditional answers about it don't really make sense. There's something else that's operational down there, which is why we get into these very unusual situations, and a lot of the science pieces that come into it. I mean, when you are talking about the hot zone, you're talking about the space program. You can't do any of the space program. NASA is honeycombed throughout the entire area. AUTEC, which is the underwater Area 51, they're honeycombed throughout the whole area. So why is everybody down there? Becomes the question.
What's
yes.
your explanation?
Well, that's why we're doing the hot zone episode.
Well, you think they're looking for what? The two eyes down?
I think it's all related. I think there's something deep about the land rising piece. I think there's something. Let's go to T.T. Brown here for a minute. Remember, T.T. Brown was going every year for a month to San Antonio, and his parents, his family thought, hey, this guy is going to San Antonio, Cuba. They learned after his death that all those trips were to San Antonio, Cuba, not San Antonio, Texas. So he was going down there, and he was going with Robert Sarbarker, who was a leading American physicist, and they were studying something on the western tip of Cuba. Now, Sarbarker becomes famous later in a weird way, which is why he's rubbed out of history, because he revealed the UFO file and said, Vannevar Bush was in charge of it. Here are the people who had it. I worked on it, but I was like a backbencher on the whole thing. And he gave out all that information, both in 1950 and later in the 80s, when the researcher Bill Stedman came and interviewed him. And he died mysteriously after that. I don't know if it was related or not. But something kind of dramatic. Remember that Sarbarker was best friends with Thomas Townsend Brown. And they would go down there and spend all this time in Cuba before the revolution. So you have to ask yourself, what were they doing down there? That study and those pieces, as we put them together, a lot of the things.
This is great. I got to throw this in.
Yeah.
Superfighter says San Antonio is St. Anthony. St. Anthony is the finder of lost things.
Oh, that's great. Well, what I notice is when you get around that western tip of Cuba, you've got the whole Zalitsky ruins off the coast. So for me, part of what they were doing there has to do with that. But there also apparently is some, just like with the Antarctic trips and with the whole geophysical year thing that we got into in the last episode about 1958, when they try to get all these scientists from all these countries to go around the world. That included the poles. And there's something geophysical about the magnetic currents down there that were being studied. There's something unusual that doesn't conform with ordinary science. This is the reason, in my opinion, why this is such a crucial area. Now, if you go deep into the Casey readings, you find this is the location of Poseidia, and this is where they generated the Two Eye Stones. So there's something very ancient about all of this, and the ruins are a good indication that there's something, you know, behind the scenes taking place. Remember, a great key in all of this is Sykes, Egerton Sykes, who was British intelligence, and so he heard all about these things, and he said they're all involved. China was involved in the 60s in this. So, you know, I've put on the record that the CIA had investigated and put agents in the ARE in 1964 trying to find out about the Hall of Records. So these groups are operating in these different areas, you know, archaeologically, the UFO file, electrical experiments, you know, gravitational experiments. The whole piece is sort of honeycombed with intelligence people. So this is what I think we get into. So we can kind of devise from watching certain characters and what was going on, like Hemingway. He's a great one in relation to this because he simultaneously is related, you know, he's hated by the FBI and the CIA, and he is also connected to the Casey Bimini piece. He's in Bimini, he's in the hot zone, he's in Cuba, he's back here, he's hounded to a point where he didn't even trust his own CIA agent son. So, you know, when he came back to America, I found this picture quite remarkable because he came back to America and he wanted to kind of live a good life. And you can see him in this picture almost trying to pick up the pieces and things. It looks like he's going to get healthy again. And what happens, very interestingly, to Hemingway is that he's complaining towards the end of his life that he's being followed and that his papers are getting gone through and that the agents that are following, he doesn't even know if they're FBI or CIA or whatever, and that it is this kind of paranoid state that he gets into. And then, you know, we have the whole thing around his death, which could very well be, as they said it, but it doesn't, it does not seem to, given the pattern of his life, seem to be where he was headed. And the original reports around Hemingway's death were that it was an accident with a gun, you know. And later we all become experts because of the Kennedy assassination on those types of accidents. So the Hemingway story, again, it's a deep story. And you have to understand the level of the Caseys and the Hemingways, which is something I've tried to really bring forward in this program. I went through letters of Hugh Lynn talking about going to spend time in Chicago with the Hemingways for a month, you know, and just think yourself and the level of friendship that you have with somebody. Who do you go and stay with for a month? They have to be a pretty good friend, you know? So that's the level of friendship that's going on there. And, you know, when we have Hemingway's mother getting these readings for Ernest, and, you know, Ernest must be kept abreast of all this things that Casey's been doing. And that's where the whole Bimini piece comes in. So part of the mystery of that history falls off. But then you have Hemingway connected and Kennedy risking a national security incident to get what Hemingway had in Cuba back to America. And then, you know, we have that whole connection of the Kennedy Library having that. This piece is there. This is something we brought out in the program. So we have to understand we're on a different level of knowledge and information. The question always is, what does it mean? And yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pelt you with a bunch of little questions.
Right.
Najat Madri, who really owns Cuba?
Well, the Cuban government, for sure. What's interesting, a lot of people have looked into this before because there's a very strange thing about how the CIA has all these plots to kill Castro and all of them fail. Whereas everyone else, they're able to bump off pretty, even our own president, right? But somehow Castro is the exception to the rule. That's odd. You know, that doesn't really add up when you think about it. And also, once the nature of the whole Cuban situation, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and these other things, Bay of Pigs situation happens, and then the assassination of Kennedy, there's a push-pull there around Cuba, but it never seems again that the United States tries to take over, you know. There is a hint when Bush is invading Iraq, the Cubans preemptively say, don't even think about it. You know, like you can play this terror thing so far, but don't think you're coming in here. So I think of Cuba as like a political football, really. That would be my best answer to it. In terms of who actually owns it, it certainly seems like the government's in charge. And, you know, the people and the groups that are supplying that support to, you know, the Castro regime and then the modern government, this gets into some very interesting territory. And, you know, we know for a fact that at a certain point that communist world withdrew from Castro with support and all the rest of it. And they came into some real crises as in relation to that. So I think if anything, we've been on a consistent program to try to bankrupt Cuba, which is where the whole Havana syndrome thing came from, in my opinion, because if they could prevent the diplomats from being there, and if they could create this uneasy situation of the Havana syndrome, which is still not explained even by our own military, then I think we're looking at a much deeper government that's going on there in relation to Cuba. Yes.
There's some really interesting answers in the ideas room.
Well, that's good.
So, okay. Ray Story, where are Polina Zelinsky's records today?
Well,
she wrote a book, didn't she?
No.
No?
No, she wrote a bio before that was about her whole background. And she has a very interesting background. She never wrote a book about the ruins. But there are a series of articles and appearances that she made, and there's a series of articles from National Geographic to New York Times and all the rest of it, that during the first decade of the 21st century, you know, it was out there. And the next leg of her investigation, remember that the story of Zelinsky goes that she'd been brought to Cuba by a KGB person, and he also abused her. And what she did was she was able, in the 60s, when this happened, to defect to Canada. And that's what she did. Later, this is what's so strange about her story. Later, Castro is looking for someone to go after Spanish galleons for the Castro regime. And he goes and he asks her company in Canada to do it. And in fact, she takes it on and she finds this incredible city. And the graphics, the accounts, and all the data, a lot, you know, so much of it is out there. And I highly recommend it. Now, I'm sure she has more data related to this, and she turned over a great deal, I'm sure, to the Cuban government. But what they decided to do after a little while was, you know, they probably thought, well, she knows a little too much. And so they gave her a hard time, and it was the Cubans who basically had her stop doing her archaeological work. And when she got to Mexico, there was some group, they continued to target her, and they put her temporarily in a prison in Mexico. So she was, you know, that was the end of that. She went back to Canada, and I've talked with her. I've communicated with her. She's a very smart person, very level-headed. She had great discoveries, and archaeology was just satisfied to leave that one off, which is kind of absurd, to be honest with you. It's the biggest archaeological discovery probably of all time. I can't think of a bigger one or a more important one, but it's left out because those stories, what they started to do with the regular coverage in the New York Times and National Geographic, is turn the stories. So first, the story came out without them, so they didn't know what to do. They had to respond and say, okay, did she find Atlantis? And they had to get on board with it because it came out outside their control. It came directly out of this Cuban government piece. But later, they were able to come forward and say, like, well, she didn't really find it. You know what she found? She found weird, like, setups of the Cuban Missile Crisis that had been dumped overboard. It's the most ridiculous thing. I mean, if you've ever seen the pictures, they're pyramids, they're temples. And the thing that she told me, which I think is very interesting, is that it's not like a temple and a pyramid and that's it. She said it's an entire city, so you're looking over a metropolis. That's the nature of the problem, I think, when you get into the hot zone, because that's a real game changer. If you have an entire city underwater, what are you going to do? You have to change history on the spot. So that's why I think she was hounded out. And that's why I think she's basically, blacklisted in a sense, that information. And they were able to whitewash the story. And so that even when I talk to people who are who are well known around the Atlantis stuff, they just blow her off, which is ridiculous because that's the most important story. And as somebody, I think, who's studied the Atlantis piece and the hot zone and brought forward the concepts and all the rest of it, I could speak pretty authoritatively. Like that's probably the most important archaeological story of history right there. Yes.
David Tormina. DJ Luis Alvarez was also the guy, along with his son, who put forth the theory that the dinosaurs went extinct because of a massive asteroid collision in the Yucatan, right in the hot zone.
Interesting. Oh, that is fascinating. Alvarez is very interesting. Whenever you find these people, like I said, who are putting on simultaneously the UFO file, the hot zone archaeological piece, and politics, then you're very deep in the system, and you've either got an ex-Protect person or an ex-Share person, or maybe somebody who's getting used by both. But I find those characters interesting. Morris Jessup is another one who's deep on the UFO file and deep in Yucatan ruins. And when you're seeing that, there's also some suggestion of intelligence work there. He's also an astronomy professor. How many different lives could this guy have? He runs a coffee company out of South America. Yeah. And then, of course, winds up dead because somebody takes his UFO book and does all these annotations relating it to the Philadelphia experiment. And there's something in that crisscross that the Navy gets a hold of. And, here's the other weird thing, and I point it out often when it comes to Jessup and characters like him and Alvarez, although I think Jessup is more of a ex-Share person. His friend was J. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Wall. So we're getting the interface here, the UFO file, Morris Jessup, his friend who he was going to see before he commits suicide, strangely, by driving into a park and, dying by carbon monoxide. He's going to see J. Manson Valentine, who he said, I want to talk to you about these things. This is important. James McDonald, the UFO expert, he was talking with Bob Wood, and he said, I think I found out the whole reason behind this whole thing. He'd been tracking UFOs for 25 years. And, he commits suicide in the middle of all that. And then people come up with these stories about Jessup. I heard this on some podcast when they were talking about Jessup, and they were like, well, things weren't going so well for him. There's a weird narrative that just sits on top of these things. Of course, we have people with deep depression and all the rest of it. But doesn't it seem a little bit odd that all of the people who are going to bring forward pieces around the UFO file or things like that, suddenly they get hit with depression and bump themselves off? That doesn't ring true for me. I'm sure there are some instances where that's legit, but it seems more to me a function of the X-Protect group. This is what they know how to do well. They type a suicide note, and then they give you a narrative that you were suffering depression because, you were divorcing your wife or something. Well, a lot of people get divorced without bumping themselves off. So, that doesn't wash for me. I think, that whole modus operandi of X-Protect is what needs to be investigated there when you get around people who are looking at the UFO file. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep episode here tonight. X-Series 143, the UFO file and the hot zone. We're taking your questions. A couple more things on TT Brown I'll get to before we're done here tonight.
Good, yes, there's some requests for that. Okay, so Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, did the breakaway technology from UFOs happen at the end of World War II? And Julie Villanueva, is Corso credible?
Yeah, Corso is credible. I don't doubt that in conversation that he didn't always explain things very well. His original book around the day after Roswell and his explanations for how we got certain types of things through the Foreign Technology Office that were, you know, UFO technology makes sense to me. So I also think the fact that he was being sued when he died, and that they were trying to shut him up is indicative that he was a problem. If you go through his records, he was where he said he was. You know, he worked for Eisenhower, he was there working with Eisenhower. Worked for General Trudeau, he was there working for General Trudeau. You know, the person who wrote the intro for his book, interestingly enough, you know, he was there were major government people who knew him who didn't know, hey, this is going to be a UFO book, and were like volunteering all these different things. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but he ran for president, and I'll think of his name. But in any case, Corso, the other thing we should remember about Corso is that he was very close friends with Gene Dixon. So there's that psychic corridor there around the UFO piece.
Was he a tech guy? The one who wrote the forward? Or was he just a politician?
No. He I can almost think of his name.
Okay.
He ran independently for president in 1948. He was the independent. He's a big senator, and he's a friend of Gene Dixon's also. I'll think of his name.
Okay.
Somebody may do it. Yes.
So Judio says Atlantis rises in 2040 or 2046, according to Casey.
No, he didn't set a date like that. What he said was that the process would start around Bimini, and he said expect the first pieces of the temple to rise in 68 or 69. That's when we get the attention around Bimini. That's when we get people like Manson Valentine and Colonel Sanders' daughter looking in that area because of the Casey prediction. And in fact, they find the Bimini Road, which is pretty amazing. You know, archaeologically underwater, I've never seen anything like that. So, you know, we're talking about land rising, and as that land rises, the ruins of the culture that's underneath there. Now, land rising, you always hear about, oh, this climate change and water's flooding and all the rest of it. We're in the middle of a shift of land masses, and this is what the mystery schools give us. It's what the Casey readings give us. So land is rising. Make no mistake about it. They don't talk about it. You will find it if you look. You can find, oh, land rose here, land is rising there. And then there's the typical thing if they say, well, even if land rose, it would take millions of years. No, that's not true. Strom Thurmond, someone got the name of the person. Strom Thurmond was the friend of Gene Dixon, and he wrote the foreword for the original Corso book. But no, what they have weather modification where they can do almost anything with anything. And so if there's land rising, they'll make it tropical pretty fast. If they can make the moon tropical, you know, if they're sending plants up to the moon, I'm sure they can do it here when an island comes up. Yes.
Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, has there been a scientific study on how fast the land is rising around Bimini? And Nance Hardwick says, what if Atlantis is the beast rising out of the sea as in Revelations?
Oh, interesting. No, I think of it as just the opposite, actually. I think of it as kind of enlightenment and awareness rising, right? If you think of it as a metaphor. But, well, it's interesting because none of the traditional scientific journals want to tackle the idea of land rising in that area. This is a psychic mystery school concept that Casey brought forward. Now, you know, the idea that land is right, you hear all the time about, oh, land's going to go under, you know, DC will be underwater because of the coastline change. Fine, but what else is taking place? What is it that's actually taking place? There's a shift then in our position in space. And the mystery school piece on this indicates that it's a pole shift that's taking place. what Casey said is it started in 1936, and this period between 58 and 98 is, we all started to feel the impact of that, which is why the culture was going through these massive changes. Now we're in the period from 98 on through the 21st century, and we're in the middle of these incredible battles in that sense. But the idea of our shift in space in relation to the poles, this is something that is taking place. So therefore lands, if you study the Casey readings, now he's got a whole different landmass map for the United States. He's got the upper part of Europe changing in the twinkling of an eye. And he predicts a lot of problems in Tierra del Fuego down there, going into the Antarctica piece. And he talks about Japan. It says the greater part of Japan must go into the sea. So, I mean, these are very unusual pieces. But what he says is that with that shift, you're going to have land coming up. And the same land that went down, that was Atlantis, is land rising. This is what we need to get our heads wrapped around. This is something that the groups that are doing this stuff are already aware of, because they know the mystery school stuff quite well. Let's make no mistake about it. What was that weird Sigma Tau thing I showed earlier? I mean, that's pretty heavy duty mystery imagery, in my opinion. Yes.
Okay, Don Devon, DJ, do you think UFOs could be ancient Atlantean?
Well, I don't discount it, because it's on the record. There's a few weird things on the record in the Casey readings and in Steiner's work about this. So one of them is that the Atlanteans had that technology. One. Two, that there were groups of them who took off. Now, he also said that they could travel anywhere in the universe, in space, and all the rest. So that's interesting. So that opens up a lot, I would say. Now, the weird part for me when it comes to Casey and the Atlantean ships is that when you're dealing, there's a reading where they're asking him, can you describe, what the Atlanteans were flying around in, to give us some idea? And he said, well, they're like the ships that Ezekiel describes, but Ezekiel's a much later date. So the question is, why is Ezekiel seeing it at a much later date? Somebody kept it. Now, the mystery schools, this whole piece around the extegonography that goes back, to the Book of the Dead, and these mystery schools held on to that. There's a reference there to the technology, and that's what I think the Hall of Records is all about. But somebody, just taking that one isolated story from Casey, somebody was still operating that stuff when Ezekiel sees it. And what, look at Ezekiel, maybe he's like 3000 BC, something like that. So somebody kept it. There is actually a quote. There's a Casey quote in Casey on Atlantis, which was John Lennon's favorite Casey book. Isn't that interesting? This will give us some idea, maybe, about the Yucatan piece. Let's see how much time we got here. I'm going to read this. So he's talking about the Two-Eyed Stone and the Firestone and how they would take it to the Penn State Museum. Now, he mentions here, as for a description of the manner of construction of the stone, we find it was a large cylindrical glass, as would be termed today, cut with facets in such a manner that the capstone on top of it made for centralizing the power or force that concentrated between the end of the cylinder and the capstone itself. Remember the capstone in the pyramid too. As indicated, the records as to ways of constructing this, the Two-Eyed Stone, are in 3 places in the earth. Records of how to construct the Two-Eyed Stone, right? 3 places in the earth as it stands today: in the sunken portion of Atlantis, or Poseidia, it's Bimini, where a portion of the temples may yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini, off the coast of Florida. Secondly, in the temple records that were in Egypt, where this entity acted later in cooperation with others towards preserving the records that came from the land where they had been kept, Atlantis. Also, thirdly, the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones, which they know so little about, are now, during the last few weeks, being uncovered, 1933. In Yucatan, there is an emblem of same. Let's clarify this, for it may be more easily found, for they will be brought to this America, these United States. A portion of it is to be carried, as we find, to the Pennsylvania State Museum. A portion of it is to be carried to the Washington Preservations of such findings, or to Chicago. December 20th, 1933. So here's what we can take away from that. The actual firestones, which are like portable versions of the main 2I crystals. They're like mini power stations. Those were being uncovered in Yucatan, and they were being sent back to Pennsylvania State Museum. Just find it interesting that anytime I get around this, that Rockwell's at Pennsylvania State, you know, all of these major people all seem to be coming through Pennsylvania State. And, you know, when we think about the Smithsonian hiding certain types of developments, and, you know, they've hidden things like giants, and they've hidden things like, you know, the type of archaeology that wouldn't fit in with their narrative. So then we have to start to wonder what they did with what they found and how far they got with it. And I think that's a legitimate line of reasoning. And if you get to thinking about how they developed the laser and all these other things, then, you know, we could see there's a real crossover between the 2I stone and the discoveries that came later. When you find somebody like Rockwell, who is part of the ARE, he's running the corporation that will launch us into space, and he also went to Penn State, then you start to thread the needle and look at those things and say, that's a pretty powerful argument that he is aware of this development. So I think this is what the message, the kind of lifting the veil around the hot zone pieces. And Casey's giving. I mean, you have to say this about the mystery schools. They laid it out there for you and I to find. I mean, it's wide open. You know, that's not hidden. That's not edited. It's, you know, it's the straight reading. So therefore, the question is, what do we do with that kind of information? Yes.
Okay, so a little science for a minute. Al Kaiser says there's a 1/4 mile thick belt of water around the equator. If the Earth's axis changes, so does that belt of water. The hot zone would be exposed. Michael Tessier says magnetic poles excursion, then shift, sun turning micronova would most likely make Atlantis physically rise, part of a 12,000 year cycle, late 2030, early 2040. And Infinitum Neo says land would rise if the Earth's poles shift, increasing the ice caps with this change. The increased ice mass pushes the Earth's bulge at the equator.
Interesting. Wow. Oh, well, that's really true. I think we need to get wrapped around this idea. We're in the period of this happening. And this is part of the weather changes. You know, everyone, they've been trying to flip out about climate change. I have no doubt that the corporations have destroyed aspects of our environment. And I don't think the alternative independent media should have any kind of misgivings about going after the corporations and saying that, yeah, there is an environmental problem, in fact. But, you know, we don't believe that people should be taxed because of that environmental issue. You know, that should be our attitude on the whole thing. But there's no question that they're taking these changes that are taking place in relation to the change of our position there with the poles, which is bringing in different types of weather. And they're saying, oh, it's climate change. You're responsible. Aren't you terrible? And that is really kind of the deceit in the middle of all that environmental activity. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
Well, let's get back into T.T. Brown.
Yeah, well, you go. Yes,
for that.
I will. I'll close out with TT actually, but you can still ask.
Well, I'll start with that. THP3 free. Does DJ think TT Brown, Tesla, etc., present a free energy avenue for us all to heal our planet?
Of course, it's in there. There's I did an entire episode on the man who developed Stanzel, who developed the perpetual motion motor, and the Casey readings that helped him, and also how this kind of disembodied governor of New York came to this guy in a vision saying, I know how to give you alternative free energy. So, you know, there's a whole episode we dedicated to Stanzel and the readings that Casey did on Stanzel. And that's a whole deep dive in and of itself. But there's no question that that alone, the perpetual motion piece, represents that aspect of the free energy coming forward. The Tesla work, of course, there's no question in my mind that through the workings of the X technology and the UFO file and those pieces, they've discovered a whole range of energy opportunities. But they're the type of opportunities, it's like the conversation between JP Morgan and Tesla. And Tesla said, oh, I can not only beam wireless telecommunications, I can beam wireless energy. And so JP Morgan went from a supporter of Tesla to get this guy, keep him down, because we don't want anything like that, because their whole dynamic was based upon how they were going to build out the fossil fuel economy the way that they had it. They didn't want wireless energy. But this is the great discovery. And so we're talking about 1908. So there's no question in my mind that the way that things are done have to do, again, with keeping us in that backward scenario where they've devised a type of reality, set up all of the different things to do it. And now with the electric cars and that whole thing, there's a real perverted thing that's going on, because those things and the way that they're developing them are terrible for the environment. And that's the whole joke that's going on here. And so they've held back all this stuff that could get us off, oil and that whole standard. And they're giving us a worse environmental opportunity. And, they're holding back the essential energy piece. So there's a whole group of people involved in breakthrough energy. And if anything, I think that those types of voices and that whole piece needs to take center stage, because at this point, so many of the things, like if we were talking about these scenarios, looking at them in the 1970s and 1980s, then you'd have opportunities to say, well, over the next 50 years, you have this and that happening. But what's happening instead is, we're in the middle, just like with the COVID thing, where some group is involved in determining humanity's fate. And, with the biometric aspects of that control, then we find ourselves in a very unfortunate position. And that is a very kind of Belial Atlantis type situation that we find ourselves, the Emilius group, in. So, these are the answers I think that we need to get to for sure. Yes.
Philomath 360, DJ, is the Gordon Cooper shipwreck map documented and or available?
Yeah. They did a TV show about it, and this is part of my problem. It's hard for me to say what's real and what's not, because they did a whole thing, and the diver who was involved with it, he knew a great deal. I don't think he was friends with Cooper. What happened was he actually lived and operated. He was in an office building with Cooper, and he got to know him. And through that, he learned that Cooper had a map that he had memorized certain coordinates from looking down. And this whole story is very interesting to me, because I think what Cooper was memorizing were positions in the hot zone. And I don't think that, I think that the cover for that was watch for nuclear weapons. But, there's just too many things to get into on that. Fundamentally, what they were looking for in that area, what they were surveying, I think that the Kennedy administration wanted particular information about that area. And there's always, oh, hey, they were looking for nuclear or whatever. Sure. I'm sure there were tons of different things that we had for that purpose, satellites and all the rest of it. How do you think we got all the photography for the Cuban Missile Crisis? But if this guy's memorizing coordinates and all the rest, then, they say, oh, it was all about Spanish galleons. Again, it could be that there's treasure hunting involved with the stuff, but I see that as a very slight thing, because if you look down and you see a whole track of a metropolis, the way that Zalitsky had seen it, remember, one of the things that got Hemingway's brother, Les Hemingway, so convinced that he actually created New Atlantis by buying lots in the ocean was that he was flying in a plane over Cuba to visit his brother, and he saw a whole city off the coast of Cuba. So, these things, these people know these things, and then where do you go with that information? This is really, I think, we start to fill in the blanks for what was going on there. But it's a fact that he founded New Atlantis, and it's a fact that for the majority of his life, Hemingway lived in Bimini and Cuba. So those things need to be threaded in with the idea that Hemingway's mother's so close to the Cases. There's no question about it. And the last question, Miss
No, I'm
Olivia.
going to give you two more.
All right.
Okay, Hizzo. So is it the Kennedys, Hemingways, and KFC versus the deep state? Explain the battle going on down there.
Well, first of all, this book, you're going to find that Margaret Sanders, I did a whole episode called The Colonel in the Hot Zone, which is a crucial adjunct to this episode. It's from last April, I think. And that episode will fill in a lot of the blanks about what Margaret Sanders was doing. But fundamentally, she searched for ruins of Atlantis in Bimini based on the Edgar Cayce readings. And she spent a great deal of time at the ARE, and Trigg is one of the first people to find those ruins that were around the Bimini Road. So therefore, they're intricate into that story. Now, it is, unfortunate. I'd spoken to Trigg, and he's a nice guy, he's a smart guy, he's a very no-nonsense guy. But he was going to do a great deal about this, as were other members of the Sanders family. And then something happened. So I'm not going to speculate what it is, but they all seem to recede very quickly. So there's something else going on in the background there about what's interesting to me is that Margaret Sanders is so interesting, because one of the things that she did when she first found the pieces that would become the Bimini Road and all the rest, she didn't want to share it with the world right away. She wanted to get more of it together because she didn't want every other treasure hunter in the world on her back with it. So, but Valentine, who was part of it, just said, oh, I'm just going to announce it because I found it basically, even though I was working with you. And so that's where that whole thing, and Margaret Sanders kind of gets lost to history on that. But in fact, she did incredible legwork to get this found. Now, here's the thing about Margaret Sanders. Margaret Sanders came up because there's a whole trail here, which is quite fascinating, that she was best friends, and I mean best friends, with Marvin Minsky, who was the MIT scientist who started AI. So she was also friends with Einstein. So, and she was at the White House often and all the rest. So she's an incredibly connected individual. But Minsky was being exploited by the Epstein-Maxwell group because they wanted him in part of their program. And so one of the things that came through Virginia Giuffre's deposition in relation to the Epsteins and the Maxwell situation was that they had targeted some very interesting people. One of them was Minsky, but the other one was Alexandra Cousteau. And so this got me on an incredible tangent, which is still unfolding, but it's an incredible breakthrough on the research that we've been doing. Because why would you target Alexandra Cousteau and try to get blackmail type information on her? She, after all, is the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau. And Jacques Cousteau's entire program for most of his life was about finding Atlantis underwater. So I think that the Epstein-Maxwell gang wanted to know what he had found. And they wanted not just to ask about it, they wanted the ability to blackmail her for it. And I think she's probably a great person and didn't get involved on that level with them, but this is what they were looking for. So I think that answers a whole lot about this. So then let's go back to Sanders for a moment. The Sanders family, deeply, deeply involved with finding Atlantis in the hot zone and the Casey ratings. So that whole piece about KFC and Colonel Sanders and all the rest of it, it's 100%, bona fide on record. And I think one of the reasons why maybe Margaret Sanders fell off the map to history is because when she married, she changed her name to Adams. And so when she was doing things under Margaret Adams, I don't think people were paying attention to her, and I think she liked it that way. But she got really far, I think, in her research around this. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, final question?
Yeah.
All right, it has to be positive. Budalove77. What can we do now to raise the consciousness of humanity, or how can we use this important information to help?
I think you're a good one to answer that.
I obviously have been studying this for a long time. The single most important thing that we can do is shift our consciousness from ego consciousness to heart-centered consciousness in any way that feels authentic to us. So by meditating on your heart center, visualizing light, that whatever it is, we need to, it's very obvious that that's what we all need to do. I like to keep it simple and, but just making a commitment to that and
no question,
staying out of fear and bringing in more love.
Absolutely. I mean, everything is one day at a time. So keep that in mind. But I do think changing, the nature of reality through infusing it with awareness about things is absolutely pertinent, because you're getting people really programmed by technology. And there are all kinds of good uses for the technology, and it allows us to have this conversation here in the ideas room. And, so I actually was the editor of a very deep tech journal. I understand the technological aspects very well. So I don't have any kind of resistance to that. But I do feel like something needs to be added on our side in terms of tools and awareness, so that process we don't get sucked into. And when I see people sucked into their phones, I think, well, it could be they're reading something interesting, or it could be that there's a kind of a brainwashing that's going on. And so therefore, are you the master of the tool or the slave of the tool? This has to be a crucial point in our own awakening.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Yes, of
course. I was
course.
listening to Jordan Peterson today, just a motivational montage that came up on my phone, which was great. And he was talking about, specifically for men, but I don't see how it's any different for women, about becoming dangerous was the word that he used. And but then it actually, formidable is kind of a better term, but it's, being capable of being dangerous, of being powerful, like a martial artist, but having the wisdom to control it, being a master. And that is ultimately what we need to be doing, because we are, as long as we are weak, we are easily controlled with fear, right? So we need to just lean into improving ourselves every day, into self-mastery. Right. And becoming, but I love the word. I've been thinking about it all day. Becoming dangerous as a positive thing.
Yeah. Well, dangerous to the establishment, I guess.
Exactly.
Becoming dynamic. I suppose, in our own realities. There's so many deep things with our friend T.T. Brown. But let me say this about Brown. This is an important little piece, not often discussed, but I like to bring it in because, again, we get the HotZone UFO piece tie over. And we have more coming up on Brown, so I might do just kind of a separate piece on Brown now that I think of it. So an interesting thing is there's a guy named Agnew Bunsen Jr. And he was kind of aspiring to be like a Howard Hughes type guy. He was a pilot, and he wanted to hire these scientists to get to deeper reality about UFOs and science and all the rest of it. So one of the guys he has come visit him is George Adamski, because he's very interested in Adamski's experiences at the time and all the things that Adamski says, hey, there's these ships and all these things happen, you know, and he's had a pretty good track record. But he's also hiring T.T. Brown to kind of go through these different things and, you know, how do flying saucers work? How do UFOs have propulsion and all the rest of it? And I love these shots of actually T.T. Brown working on these models and demonstrating these different effects and things. And of course, you know, he's holding these kind of miniature saucers. And I think the whole shape of things were fascinating to him. These other shots, I think, are very interesting of him in the lab working out. But one of the fascinating things that exists is this picture, and it comes from Bunsen's library. And it's after T.T. Brown visits him. Then we get this, which is a miniature model of Adamski's craft hanging out in some kind of vat of liquid. So somehow Brown had demonstrated that Adamski's craft could work in such and such a way. And Bunsen has this very unusual model. Now, Bunsen has a very strange, after this happens, he puts out a novel, and I've cited this novel before, called The Stars Are Too High, about a group of these kind of advanced scientists who get together and they decide, you know what, we're going to create a UFO incident, and it's going to force everyone to the table to declare peace on the Russian and American side. And so there's a whole story involved with it, and it's, you know, they create this UFO and it creates this worldwide stir and all the rest of it. Bunsen will die 2 years in a plane crash, 2 years after writing the book. And it's a very interesting book. There's a lot of layers to it if you can get to it. And the setup is the appearance of a strange spaceship brings astounding results in the Pentagon and Kremlin in this prophetic novel of a near future. And that's a picture of Bunsen there. But this is an unusual chapter because it involves T.T. Brown, Adamski, and this kind of Howard Hughes wannabe. And then this very interesting novel set in the middle of it. Now, flash forward to a few years later, and this is something that Linda Brown told me. And Linda's quite interesting. She gave me a very interesting version of her dad's, a book about her dad. And I hope to be speaking with her again and other members of the family. But what happened was she told me about working with T.T. Brown, and actually she had become kind of his lab assistant. And he was allowing her to, you know, before he had these other assistants and he kept her out of it. Now he was like, hey, I want you involved. So he had this thing called the acoustic fan. And this is a demonstration. They call it here the electrokinetic apparatus. And he's demonstrating it there for Rand. So very interestingly, she helps him with this demonstration. And the demonstration includes people like Curtis LeMay, for example. He's the Joint Chiefs, and really known as the guy who wanted to drop the nuclear bomb on Cuba. And a long story short, and this one really goes deep, that fan relates to something that happened to him when he was in college. And he saw an orb over a body of water, and it came at him full force, and it knocked him down, and it scared his horse. And in the middle of that whole thing happening, it gave him a vision of his entire life, the future, and everything that would happen. And it communicated to him his role and how he would be involved. So, interestingly enough, over the years, he decided there's a way to develop a machine that can do that. And one of his assistants that he worked with went on record saying, you know, he put me in front of this acoustic fan, and the whole thing that happened to him happened to me. I had a big flash forward of everything that I was supposed to do in my life and the impact I would have and all the rest of it. So after he demonstrates this acoustic fan, he goes to his daughter and he says, "You're going to Europe." And she said, "We're doing all this work. We're doing great." And she said, "What about the acoustic fan?" And he says, "Forget you ever heard about it. Forget I even mentioned it. Forget the demonstration and forget being my assistant. Just go to Europe, go to college. That's it." And this is the nature of the deep work that he had done. And somewhere that acoustic fan that was spirited away by Rand International in the late 60s, they must be doing a lot with it. And I think that'll give us some hint as to the nature of the technological environment that we're in and the crossover of a more kind of metaphysical reality with all that. And with that, Miss Olivia, I am going to wrap up the episode.
Okay, 1 second. Ogum5 says, can we finally determine whether T.T. Brown did have a relationship with Leeds Skalnin?
I'll probably, I have a thing, actually, I had some stuff about Leeds Skalnin, but I'm going to put those together in an episode for you because I think it gets a kind of a bigger answer. But I think what we can answer succinctly is that there's a lot of very interesting on the records meetings that T.T. Brown had, and there's a number of off the record interactions that are speculated upon with very kind of a really good background. And I think we can get some answers on those. And I've been able to go behind the veil on some of the T.T. Brown stuff through his family. So let's see if I can't get you some of those deeper answers.
Okay, just one last thing. Drew Black, DJ, what do you make of Roger Stone on Twitter saying that Nixon threatened the CIA with exposure concerning the death of JFK? And on Alex Jones, right?
Yeah, well, this is this is the I actually mentioned this tape, and it came out and it was actually came out close to a year ago at this point. And it's listed pretty well in a book that Jefferson Morley did. I think it's called The Scorpion. And it's got a whole back and forth with Jeff Morley going into the relationship between our friend Richard Nixon and Richard Helms, the CIA director. And what the tape contains is Nixon saying, you know, I want to be able to protect the CIA when we get asked this whole thing about who shot John. And the point that I've made in a number of episodes for a few months mentioning this tape is that unless you know some other John that he's talking about there, it's pretty likely that he's addressing the CIA director and asking him, you know, how can I protect you in terms of what the CIA did? And what he's asking them for are the CIA records relating to this. So this is, you know, this is something we've reported on. Now, it's very interesting. Stone recently heard about this, and he put it out there as a big thing that just hit. But in fact, we mentioned it, I I think 3 or 4 months ago, and I think Morley put out his book about earlier this year. So that's been out there for a little while. It is interesting. And I think maybe what you're going to find is the push-pull between the Nixon tapes and what we get to hear on them is interesting. I've pointed this out before, where the Watergate tapes are interesting because when the government is trying to go against the Nixon family, they're still trying to get the tapes. So they have some of them, but they don't have all of them. And what's interesting is when they get the tapes, they don't give them to us in a transparent fashion. What they do is they decide what they want public, and they'll erase the rest themselves. They'll black out the rest from public disclosure. So this idea that like somehow the government is being transparent with us by getting the Nixon tapes, weirdly enough, they blot a lot of it out themselves. So that's the interesting thing. But I'm absolutely convinced that Nixon is aware of the different roles involved there, and that's part of the LBJX letter against Nixon relates to the UFO file, and part of Nixon's knowledge relates to the fact that JFK was killed over the UFO file. This is, I think, maybe the real earthquake in the middle of that. And we've cited the Watergate figure, Douglas Caddy, who we had on the program, who said E. Howard Hunt told him in private. That's pretty good. That's a historical figure. And Caddy, being the Watergate lawyer, saying that E. Howard Hunt told him in private that Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. Together with all the other information that we have, it makes the most sense. And this is the nature of that battle between X-Protect and X-Share that we spotlight on the show. So yeah, absolutely. Just absolutely fascinating.
Do you still have that picture of the sigil?
Oh, from the Sigma Tau?
Mm.
Interesting. I'll put it up on Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is quite fascinating. But
there were some great insights from people in the ideas room.
Really? Oh, yeah. Great. Fantastic. I can't wait to read it. And it's great to have so many of you. I'm going to do some shout outs. Actually, why don't you call our super chats?
All right. Super chatters. A cult fan, Gil and Joy R, Catherine Rorden, Bill Mayo, Debbie McAdoo, Robert Scott, Wait a Minute 72, Sun Hero, Undestroyer, Slow Time, W.C. Ray, The Weed in Your Garden, Sandra Lavender, Lance Boivin, Chase Anderson, Erica Swenson Elliott, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Atlantis is Found, Donna G, Renee Smith, Christo, Mer Bowman, Doreen Hewitt, Norman Smith, Eurythmia's Fun, Mike A, Jennifer Walters, Karen Carpenter, Infinitum Neo, Johnny, this is a hard one, Meyer Hiel, Hizzo, and Happy Camper.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Wow. Incredible support. We really appreciate it. It helps us to keep going and doing the work that we're doing. And also to all our subscribers, thank you. We will be back with you next week. We've got the X State of the Union coming up. You don't want to miss it. Some deep pieces coming in there. And we also have some exciting episodes coming up for you and some great interviews as well. Remember, if you haven't already, go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for that newsletter that keeps us connected. And I'm going to do a couple of shout outs here that I can see. Silent Murmur, it's great to see you out there. Gigi Young is out there. Unbelievable. Her recent show is just absolutely amazing. It's great to see you. Kate Garcia, thank you very much. Max Lupo. Donaway, great to see you. Liddy Lou, love you guys. Thank you. Olivia, of course, did a great job. Outstanding. Golden Girl. Wow, great show. Good times. Have fun, everyone. I like that. Karen Carpenter. Fantastic.
I know everybody's starving for KFC now.
That's what it is. Subliminal. Let's see. Kate, I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Brenda Fisher, Golden Girl, Pono, Undestroyer, Black Zionist. Thanks, Team Super Chat. That's the ideas room right there. His D, Lois, Jennifer Walters. Good night, friends. Yes, that's what it is. It's good night, friends. Fantastic. What a great crowd tonight. Outstanding questions, just off the charts. Amazing.
Outstanding.
Really great. And thank you. The way that you put that all together, fantastic. Undestroyer, thank you. Love the show. Appreciate it. Well, I really appreciate it. Brad Briggs, wonderful show. Thank you. Well, I have to say, whenever we get into the hot zone, there's so much to get into. I feel like I could do another 3 hours with you. So we're going to do more on the hot zone coming up soon. And I think Rockwell is maybe kind of a breakthrough around that as well. Pat Kelly, Fubar Fighter, Silent Murmur. Yeah, what do you got?
Well, I just wanted to throw this out there. So David Donaway said Thomas B. Pickens III, founder and CEO of Astrogenetics, location Austin, Texas. You're familiar with them? And
Interesting.
Astrotech?
Yeah.
Bioweapons in space.
Oh, that's
Astrogenetics
right.
is the first biotech company to research and develop novel therapeutic products in the unique environment of microgravity in space. When the Mellon family assist bioscience in space, mutations can swiftly serve for study and bioweapons potential on Earth.
This is an interesting thing because Astrotech was involved with space vaccines. I thought that was interesting. You know, that company, let me tell you, Lockheed Martin bought their space exploration division, but they are directly, you know, assisting in SpaceX putting up the whole Starlink bit. So that's right in the heart of everything. Esther Taylor.
They're not going to stop. I hate, you know, I think that it's
control
dawning
from
on
above.
all of us.
That's what it is. And that's the whole thing about the space grid and that control, the global control grid from space. This is a very old plan. And, you know, the more that it gets out, the more that it gets into people's heads that that's a very unhealthy power differential. And, you know, that's the thing that needs to be righted, because you're never going to get any kind of successful civilization with that kind of imbalance. And especially if you get a kind of fascist, you know, as we've seen these people turn on the dime, and it's emergency powers and they've got fascists and they start walking around talking about martial law. That's who they are, really. And so we no illusions about that. But I think the conversation that we have here in the ideas room is exactly the thing that, you know, that they try to prevent. So we really want to pay attention to that, which is this kind of interaction is the thing that forms the foundation of getting those better ideas and opening up that creativity and awareness. And that's what we're doing here. So with that, Miss Olivia, we will see you all next week. And the X State of the Union, it's coming. It's great to see everyone. And thank you so much for being here. We'll see you all next week. And, you know, it says end broadcast, but after all.
Not really.
Okay. A little slow on that one. I'll try it again.
I thought you were going to end with the other thing.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Well, I think, oh, wow. Daniel Foster, Joseph Orlando, Little Lou, Brenda Fisher, just a great crew in there tonight. Outstanding. We will see you all next week. Okay. And the broadcast, as we said, never really ends.
God bless.